Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that feels both ancient and oddly modern. What was the daily grind like for the people who built the pyramids? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Forget the image of a man with a whip. That's a Hollywood invention. Your overseer might yell, he might get frustrated, but he knows you are a valuable skilled worker. A broken laborer is a useless laborer. This is a national project, not a punishment. The Great Beer Flood was not the only strange industrial disaster of its time. The 19th century was a period of rapid, often unregulated industrialization, and it was plagued by a host of bizarre and tragic accidents. In 1864, the Sheffield Great Flood was caused by a newly constructed dam that collapsed, killing over 240 people. In Boston in 1919, a massive tank of molasses ruptured, creating the, quote, molasses flood that killed 21 people. These events, while seeming strange to us now, were part of the dangerous reality of living in the industrial age. They were the terrifying growing pains of a world rapidly transforming, where the scale of industry often outpaced the understanding of its risks. The legacy of the pyramid builders is, of course, the pyramids themselves. But it's more than just the physical structures. It's the legacy of what they represent, the power of collective human effort, the incredible potential of organized labor, and the ability of a society to mobilize around a single, unifying idea. The pyramids are a testament to a worldview where the sacred and the practical were deeply intertwined, where building a tomb was the most important work a nation could undertake. As you drift off to sleep, consider the quiet, enduring presence of these structures, a silent conversation across 400 or 500 years, from the hands of their builders to our own imaginations. The aftermath of the Emu War had a direct impact on Australian agricultural policy. The failure of the military intervention demonstrated that top-down, brute force solutions were not always effective for managing complex ecological problems. The success of the bounty system, while grim, showed the power of decentralized, incentive-based approaches. This lesson, learned in a bizarre conflict with birds, would inform future policies regarding pest control and land management. The war, for all its comedy, was a practical, if rather loud, lesson in public administration, and the importance of choosing the right tool for the job. Sometimes, a hunter with a rifle is more effective than a soldier with a machine gun. The materials used for forks throughout history tell a story of wealth and technology. The very first forks of the Byzantine princess were made of solid gold, an unimaginable luxury. For centuries, forks remained the playthings of the rich, crafted from silver. As manufacturing techniques improved, less precious metals like steel and pewter were used, but these often tainted the food with a metallic taste. The invention of silver plating in the 18th century was a major breakthrough, allowing for the mass production of forks that had the look and feel of silver without the prohibitive cost. Finally, the development of stainless steel in the 20th century made the durable, affordable, and taste-neutral fork a reality for everyone. A quiet and often overlooked aspect of Heidi Lamar's story is the role of her first husband, Friedrich Mandl, an Austrian arms manufacturer. It was at dinner parties in their home that a young Heidi, bored and underestimated by the powerful men around her, would listen intently to discussions of military technology and weapons systems. This was her accidental education in the field. Mandl treated her as a trophy, but in doing so, he inadvertently exposed her to the very problems she would later try to solve. Her invention was, in a way, a form of intellectual revenge, using the knowledge gained during a miserable period of her life to create something that would help defeat the very fascist forces her husband had associated with. The physical sensation of the beer flood would have been deeply strange. Unlike a flood of water, a wave of beer is denser, stickier, and full of foam. It would have moved more slowly, but with more force, carrying a powerful current of debris with it. Survivors describe being overwhelmed by the fumes and the suffocating nature of the foam. It would have been disorienting, a bizarre sensory overload in the midst of a life-threatening disaster. The experience of nearly drowning in a substance normally associated with conviviality and relaxation adds a layer of surreal horror to the event, making it a uniquely unsettling chapter in the history of urban disasters. The belief in the afterlife was so central to the pyramid builders. that they willingly participated in a system that saw the pharaoh take a vast amount of the kingdom's resources with him. This wasn't seen as wasteful. The pharaoh's successful journey ensured the continued prosperity and stability of the living. It was an investment. Furthermore, the objects and wealth buried with the pharaoh were not considered lost. They were being transferred to the other world, where he would need them to perform his divine duties. The tomb was not just a grave. It was a launch pad, a fully equipped vessel for the most important voyage a king could make. And the entire nation was the ground crew. The Emu War has had a surprisingly long life in popular culture. It's a perennial favorite on internet forums and weird history lists. The story's appeal lies in its perfect comedic structure. The hubris of the humans, the surprising competence of the underdog, the emus, and the ultimate ignominious defeat of the powerful. It's a real-life fable that feels like it was written by a satirist. This enduring popularity has ensured that Major Meredith and his avian adversaries will never be forgotten. They are immortalized, not in grand war memorials, but in the shared, digital folklore of the 21st century. A story that is just too good and too strange not to retell. The etiquette of utensil use became a minefield of social signals. The way you held your fork, the way you cut your meat, whether you rested your utensils on the plate or the tablecloth, all of these were scrutinized. An entire subgenre of books emerged to guide the socially anxious through the complexities of formal dining. These manuals were bestsellers, promising to teach the newly rich how to eat like the old rich. The fork was no longer just a tool for eating. It was a tool for social navigation, a small metal key that could either unlock the doors to polite society or expose you as an outsider. George Antheil, Hedy Lamar's co-inventor, deserves a moment in the spotlight. His own life was as unconventional as hers. As a composer, he was famous for his ballet mécanique, which used airplane propellers, sirens, and electric bells as musical instruments. His fascination with mechanical automation was the perfect practical complement to Lamar's conceptual brilliance. After their patent, he went on to have a more conventional career composing film scores in Hollywood. He too received little recognition for the invention during his lifetime. The story of the secret communication system is as much his as it is hers, a forgotten chapter in the life of one of the 20th century's most audacious musical minds. You feel a sense of pride in the work. You are not a slave, but a paid professional, a participant in the most ambitious construction project the world has ever seen. You are building an eternal home for your God King. One of the most heartbreaking stories from the London beer flood is that of the Tavistock Arms pub, which stood directly in the path of the wave. The pub's cellar was flooded, and the wall collapsed, trapping the teenage barmaid Eleanor Cooper under the rubble. She was alive when the wave hit, but died before rescuers could reach her. Her death highlights the indiscriminate nature of the disaster. It wasn't just the residents of the tenements who were at risk, but anyone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a sudden, violent intrusion of industrial failure into the ordinary rhythm of city life. The organization of the pyramid builders' work was based on a 10-day week. They would work for 10 consecutive days and then have a day of rest. This cycle governed the pace of their lives. During their time off, they could tend to their own affairs, work on their personal tombs, or participate in village life. This regular, state-sanctioned day of rest is another piece of evidence against the theory of slave labor. Slaves are not typically given scheduled days off. This system recognized the need for recovery and personal time, ensuring the workforce remained healthy, productive, and reasonably content over the long, grueling decades of construction. One of the reasons the Emu War was so ineffective was the vastness of the territory. The wheat belt of Western Australia is an immense, sprawling area. The soldiers, with their 2 machine guns, were trying to police an area of hundreds of square miles. It was an impossible task. The emus could simply move from one farm to another, staying one step ahead of the military patrol. The army's strategy was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The scale of the problem dwarfed the scale of the solution. This fundamental mismatch between the challenge and the resources allocated to it doomed the campaign from the very beginning. The fork's triumph also led to the decline of another table utensil, the personal ewer and basin. In medieval and Renaissance feasts, hand-washing was a formal, public part of the meal. But as the fork made eating a cleaner affair, this ceremony became less critical. The act of hygiene became privatized, something done before and after the meal, not during. This shift reflects a broader change in our concepts of public and private, clean and dirty. The fork helped to draw a line around the individual, creating a more sterile, less communal dining experience for better or for worse. Heidi Lamar's inventive streak did not end with the frequency-hopping patent. She continued to tinker and brainstorm throughout her life. She was fascinated by aerodynamics and was said to have advised Howard Hughes on improving the design of his airplanes. She was always observing, analyzing, and looking for ways to make things better. This relentless intellectual curiosity is perhaps the most defining trait of her personality, even more so than her beauty. It was the engine that drove her, a constant quiet hum beneath the glamorous noise of her public life. The world saw a star, but she was at her core a problem solver. The financial and social impact of the beer flood on the victims' families was devastating. In an era with no life insurance or social safety net, the death of a primary earner could plunge a family into utter destitution. The few possessions they had were destroyed, and their homes were uninhabitable. While the brewery was absolved of legal blame, some accounts suggest they made small, informal payments to the families to cover funeral costs. But this was an act of charity, not obligation. For the survivors, the flood was not just a one-day event. It was a catastrophe that would shape the rest of their impoverished lives. The sheer logistics of feeding the pyramid workforce were staggering. Archaeologists estimate that the bakeries and breweries near the Giza Plateau were producing thousands of loaves of bread and gallons of beer every single day. These were not small-scale operations. They were industrial-sized food production facilities. The state had to manage a massive supply chain, bringing in grain from the fertile Nile Delta, processing it, and distributing it efficiently to the thousands of workers. This bread and beer economy was the invisible engine that powered the entire construction. The pyramids stand on a foundation of not just stone, but of countless loaves of bread and jars of beer. The emus' behavior during the war has been a subject of some lighthearted debate. Did they really have a leader giving tactical commands? Almost certainly not. The appearance of organized, guerrilla-like behavior was more likely the product of instinct and simple flock dynamics. An emu's primary defense mechanism is to run from danger. When one senses a threat, it runs, and the others, seeing it run, follow suit. The leader was probably just the most alert or nervous bird in the group. But the effect from the soldier's perspective was the same as a coordinated retreat. It's a wonderful example of how we often project human patterns and intentions onto the natural world. The fork's journey is, ultimately, a story about changing ideas of the body. In the Middle Ages, the body was seen as a more porous, public thing. Sharing cups, plates, and food with your hands was a sign of fellowship. The rise of the fork is part of a long-term shift towards viewing the body as a private, self-contained entity that needed to be protected from the outside world. It's a tool that reinforces the boundary between me and you, between my food and your food, my germs and your germs. It's a small, metal reflection of a profound change in Western consciousness. Even after her patent was rediscovered, Hedy Lamar's role was sometimes downplayed, with more credit given to George Antheil. This reflects a persistent bias in how we record the history of science and technology, where the contributions of women have often been minimized or attributed to their male collaborators. It took decades of advocacy by historians and technologists to fully cement her place as the primary conceptual force behind the invention. Her story has become a key case study in the fight for a more inclusive and accurate historical record, a reminder to always ask who might have been left out of the story. As the sun climbs to its highest, most punishing point, you break for the midday meal. There are no lunchboxes. Instead, state-provided rations are distributed, more bread, a handful of onions or garlic, and the most important part of your compensation, beer. The legal term act of God used in the beer flood case has a long and fascinating history itself. It's a legal concept used to describe events that are beyond human control, like earthquakes or hurricanes. Applying it to a ruptured, man-made beer vat is a bit of a stretch. The verdict was a reflection of a legal system that was highly protective of industry and property rights. It created a convenient loophole that allowed companies to avoid liability for industrial accidents, placing the burden of risk squarely on the public, and particularly on the poor who lived and worked in the most dangerous conditions. The workers' village was not a temporary camp. It was a permanent settlement. People were born, lived, and died there. This stability meant that skills could be passed down through generations. A master mason would train his son, who would in turn train his. This created a highly specialized hereditary workforce with a deep institutional knowledge of a very specific set of tasks. The consistency and quality of the construction over so many decades is a direct result of this generational transmission of skill. The pyramids were not built by a random collection of laborers, but by a dynasty of craftsmen. The failure of the Great Emu War led to some serious soul-searching within the Australian government, at least on the topic of pest control. It highlighted the limitations of military solutions for what were essentially agricultural and environmental problems. In the years that followed, Australia would become a world leader in developing more scientific and nuanced approaches to managing its unique and often challenging fauna. The country pioneered biological control methods, like the introduction of the myxoma virus to control rabbit populations. In a way, the embarrassing defeat at the hands of the emus spurred a more sophisticated and ultimately more successful approach to living with wildlife. The fork's physical form is a testament to elegant design. The curve of the tines, the balance of the handle, the space between the prongs, all have been refined over centuries to create a tool that is both beautiful and perfectly functional. It can spear, scoop, and steady. It's a small masterpiece of ergonomic design that we interact with every day without a second thought. Its evolution from a sharp, two-pronged spear to the versatile instrument on our dinner tables is a quiet history of problem-solving and refinement, a slow and steady pursuit of the perfect way to get food from the plate to the mouth. One of the great what-ifs of Heidi Lemaire's story is what might have happened if her inventive talents had been nurtured from a young age. In a different time, or a different family, her scientific curiosity might have been encouraged, leading to formal education in engineering or physics. It's tantalizing to imagine what a fully trained and supported Heidi Lemare could have accomplished. Her story is a testament to the power of innate talent, but it's also a poignant reminder of the potential that is lost when society's expectations limit the paths available to individuals based on their gender, or, in her case, their beauty. The cleanup of the Great Beer Flood was a formidable task. There were no public sanitation departments or emergency services in the modern sense. The cleanup was largely left to the residents and the brewery itself. They would have used buckets and shovels to clear the thick, sludgy mess from the streets and cellars. The damaged buildings had to be torn down. For weeks, the neighborhood would have been a chaotic construction and demolition site. The disaster left a physical scar on the landscape of St. Giles that took months to heal, and an emotional scar on the community that would last much longer. The religious beliefs of the pyramid builders were deeply practical. They didn't just believe in the gods, they worked alongside them. The pharaoh was a living god, Horus. The materials they used, like granite from Aswan, were associated with the sun god Ra. The Nile itself was the god Hapi. Their daily labor was a constant interaction with the divine. This worldview imbued their work with a profound sense of meaning. They weren't just building for a distant, abstract deity. They were building for their boss, their king, and their world, all of which were inextricably linked in a sacred living cosmology. The farmers who instigated the Great Emu War were in a truly desperate situation. They were often soldier settlers, given plots of land after World War I as a reward for their service. But the land was marginal, and they lacked the capital and experience for large-scale farming. They were already struggling with debt and the falling price of wheat due to the Great Depression. The arrival of the emus was the final straw, a threat to the very last thing they had. Their plea for military assistance, while sounding extreme, came from a place of profound economic desperation. They weren't just protecting their crops. They were fighting for their livelihoods. The fork helped to create the modern restaurant as we know it. In older inns and taverns, diners would often bring their own knives and eat from a common pot. The rise of individual place settings with a full complement of utensils provided by the establishment was a key development in the professionalization of dining. It allowed restaurants to offer a more refined, standardized experience. The fork, in this sense, is a symbol of the shift from a rough-and-ready public house to a formal dining establishment, a place where the performance of eating was as important as the food itself. Heidi Lemare's story has had a significant impact on modern perceptions of women in STEM fields. She has become a posthumous icon for female inventors and engineers, a historical role model who defied stereotypes. Her story is often told to young girls to encourage them to pursue their interests in science and technology, to show them that a passion for these fields can coexist with any other interest or identity. In a way, her final legacy is not the technology itself, but the inspiration her story provides to a new generation of innovators who are determined not to be overlooked. This isn't the beer you might be thinking of. It's thick, nutritious, and cloudy, more like a fermented, drinkable sourdough than a lager. It's packed with calories and vitamins, the fuel that powers this entire monumental undertaking. The Mew and Company Brewery had another moment of fame, or infamy, several decades after the beer flood. In the 1850s, it was the site of a major labor dispute as the brewery's draymen, the men who drove the beer carts, went on strike. The event became a cause célèbre in London, highlighting the growing power of organized labor. The brewery, which had once been the source of a literal, deadly flood, became the epicenter of a symbolic, social one. Its history is a microcosm of the 19th century, a story of industrial might, tragic accidents, and the slow, steady rise of the working class. The health of the pyramid builders is a subject of great interest to bioarchaeologists. Skeletons found in the workers' cemeteries show a population that was generally robust and well-nourished. However, they also show signs of the immense physical toll of the work. Arthritis, particularly in the back and knees, was common. Healed fractures are frequent, indicating that while accidents happened, workers often received effective medical care that allowed them to recover and return to work. Their bones tell a silent story of a hard life of strenuous labor, but also one of resilience and a society that invested in keeping its workforce functional. The emu's reputation in Australia has always been a bit mixed. On the one hand, it's a national symbol, featured on the country's coat of arms alongside the kangaroo, chosen because neither animal can easily move backward, symbolizing a nation moving forward. On the other hand, for farmers, it has long been considered a major pest. The Great Emu War is the most dramatic expression of this conflicted relationship. It's a story of a country trying to reconcile its identity as a modern agricultural nation with the wild, untamable nature of the continent itself. The emu, a flightless bird that defeated an army, perfectly embodies this central tension in the Australian psyche. The fork's journey is not over. As global food cultures merge, the fork now shares the table with other utensils, most notably chopsticks. In many modern Asian restaurants, a place setting might include both, offering diners a choice. This reflects a new stage in the history of eating, a globalized, multicultural approach where no single tradition is dominant. The fork, once a controversial invader, is now learning to coexist. Its story continues to evolve, a quiet reflection of the ever-changing way we share and consume food around the world. The patent system itself played a crucial role in Hedy Lamarr's story. A patent grants an inventor a temporary monopoly on their invention, but it also requires them to publicly disclose how it works. This is the trade-off. Hedy and George's patent laid out their idea for the world to see, but because it expired before the technology to implement it became widespread, they were unable to profit from it. Their story is a classic example of an idea that was too far ahead of the technological curve. They had the right concept, but the rest of the world had to catch up, and by the time it did, their window of opportunity had closed. The site of the St. Giles Rookery was eventually cleared in the mid-19th century, not because of the beer flood, but as part of a major urban renewal project that created New Oxford Street. The slum was demolished, and its residents were displaced, replaced by wide avenues and grand commercial buildings. The memory of the Rookery and its tragedies, including the beer flood, was literally paved over. It's a classic story of urban development, where the history of the poor is erased to make way for the commerce of the wealthy. The physical landscape changed, but the social problems of poverty and displacement simply moved elsewhere. The social life of the pyramid builders wasn't all work. Evidence from the workers' village suggests a vibrant community life. They played games like Senet, a popular board game. They held festivals and religious ceremonies. They brewed beer and baked bread in their own homes. In addition to receiving state rations, they had families, neighbors, and disputes that were settled in their local court. They were not mindless drones. They were full human beings, living complex lives within the extraordinary context of their work. The village was a real town, not just a labor camp. The Australian government's official report on the Emu War is a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement. It acknowledges the difficulties encountered and the small number of birds killed, but it avoids any language that might suggest a military humiliation. The report concludes that the operation was not cost-effective and that the bounty system would be a more prudent course of action. It's a classic example of a government trying to put the best possible spin on a failed and slightly embarrassing policy. The dry, formal language of the report stands in hilarious contrast to the chaotic, farcical reality of the events it describes. The fork's influence extends beyond the dinner table. The very phrase, "a fork in the road," uses the utensil as a metaphor for a moment of decision, a branching of paths. This reflects the fork's fundamental nature as a tool of division and choice. Its entry into our language shows just how deeply it has become embedded in our consciousness. It is no longer just an object. It is a concept, a symbol that we use to make sense of our own lives and the choices we face. Hedy Lamarr was a master of cultivating her own mystique. She was famously private and gave few interviews in her later years. This reclusiveness only added to her legend. It allowed people to project their own ideas onto her, to see her as the tragic, forgotten genius or the glamorous, aging star. In a way, she curated her final act by withdrawing from the stage. Her silence was as powerful as her on-screen presence, creating a space for her story to be rediscovered and retold, ensuring that she would be remembered on her own terms, not just as a Hollywood product. Accidents happen. A rope snaps. A stone shifts. You see men with splinted arms and bandaged legs. But the medical care is surprisingly sophisticated. Doctors on site set bones, stitch wounds, and even perform rudimentary surgery. Your life has value. The Great Beer Flood has a curious parallel in literature. Just a few years later, Mary Shelley would write Frankenstein, a novel about the dangers of unchecked scientific and industrial ambition. The beer flood was a real-life industrial monster, and creation of man that broke free of its restraints and wreaked havoc on its creators and the innocent people nearby. Both the fictional story and the real-life event serve as cautionary tales for their age, warnings about the potential for our own creations to turn against us in terrifying and unexpected ways. The pyramids were not built in isolation. They were the centerpieces of a vast, sacred landscape. Their positioning was not random. It was carefully planned to align with the stars and the path of the sun. The causeways that connected the pyramids to their valley temples were oriented to specific astronomical events. The entire Giza Plateau was a kind of massive, stone computer, designed to track the cosmos and ensure the pharaoh's smooth transition into it. The builders were not just masons. They were practical astronomers, shaping the earth to reflect the heavens. The Emu War is a story that defies easy categorization. Is it military history, agricultural history, environmental history? It's all of these and none of them. Its refusal to fit into a neat historical box is part of its enduring charm. It's a reminder that the past is not always a series of neat, serious narratives. Sometimes it's just messy, strange, and unintentionally funny. The story of the Emu War gives us permission to laugh at history, to see the absurdity that often exists just beneath the surface of the grand events. The fork has a dark side in folklore and superstition. It was sometimes associated with the devil's pitchfork, which contributed to the early religious opposition to it. There's also an old superstition that dropping a fork means a man will soon visit. These small, lingering beliefs are like faint echoes of the fork's controversial past. They remind us that before it was a simple tool, it was an object loaded with symbolic meaning, a focal point for anxieties about religion, foreignness, and the proper way to live. The recognition that Hedy Lamarr eventually received was important, but it's also worth noting what she didn't get: financial compensation. Because her patent had long expired, the companies that built multi-billion-dollar industries on the back of her core idea, companies in the mobile phone, GPS, and Wi-Fi sectors, owed her nothing. She died in 2000 with a relatively modest estate. It's the final, bitter irony of her story. She gave the world a gift that fundamentally reshaped modern communication, and the world, in return, gave her a few awards and a belated thank you. The brewery's name, Mew, is pronounced Muse. The company was a major player in the London brewing scene for over 150 years. After the disaster, they rebuilt and modernized, becoming even more successful. The story of the flood became a strange part of their corporate lore, a bizarre incident in a long history of production. For the company, it was a dramatic but ultimately survivable setback. For the families of St. Giles, it was an absolute and final tragedy. This stark difference in outcomes is the very heart of the story's historical lesson. The colors of the pyramids have been lost to time. We see them today as monochrome, sand-colored mountains, but in their prime, they were dazzling. The main body was cased in gleaming white Tura limestone, polished to a mirror-like finish. The pyramidion at the top may have been gilded in gold. Some temples and causeways were painted with vibrant colors and covered in intricate carvings. The Giza Plateau would have been a stunning, almost blindingly bright spectacle. The builders were creating not just a monument, but a work of art on a continental scale, a shining symbol of the pharaoh's power and divinity. The story of the Emu War highlights the different ways we value animals. The emus were seen as pests, obstacles to economic progress, and therefore expendable. The soldiers, horses on the other hand, were valuable assets. This hierarchy of animal value is a common theme in human history. We protect and nurture the animals that serve our purposes as food, labor, or companions, while we often seek to eliminate the ones that inconvenience us. The Emu War is a stark, if comical, example of this utilitarian view of the natural world in action. The fork's journey reflects the spread of ideas. It moved from court to court, from country to country, carried by princesses, travelers, and merchants. Its adoption was a slow process of cultural diffusion. Each new society that encountered it had to decide whether to accept or reject this foreign innovation. The fork's story is a case study in how culture changes. Not through grand pronouncements, but through a slow, grassroots process of imitation, adaptation, and eventual acceptance, until the strange becomes familiar and the foreign becomes our own. Heidi Lamar's story is a powerful counter-narrative to the lone genius myth. While the core idea for frequency hopping was hers, she needed George Antheil's practical knowledge to make it work. She needed a patent attorney to navigate the legal system. Her story shows that even the most brilliant inventors often rely on collaboration and the expertise of others. Innovation is rarely a solo act. It's a process of connection, of finding the right people with the right skills to help turn a brilliant spark into a functional reality. The work is grueling. A 10-day on, 1-day off cycle. Your back aches, your hands are calloused, and your skin is burned by the sun. But there is a rhythm to it, a sense of shared purpose that makes the impossible feel manageable. The Great Beer Flood is a story that lives at the intersection of technology and society. The massive vat was a marvel of industrial technology for its time, a way to produce beer on an unprecedented scale. But this technology was placed in the heart of a vulnerable community without adequate safeguards. The disaster is a powerful reminder that technological progress is never neutral. It always has social consequences, and those consequences are often borne by the people with the least power to control them. As we conclude our exploration for tonight, let's return one last time to the silent, watchful gaze of the Sphinx, a silent witness to the generations of builders who toiled in its shadow. The workers who built the pyramids are anonymous to us now, their individual names lost to the sands of time. But their collective achievement endures. They built structures so massive and so enduring that they have become symbols of eternity itself. In a way, they achieved the very immortality they sought for their king. And so, as you drift into sleep, may you find a similar sense of peace, a quiet connection to the long, deep, and wonderfully strange river of human history. The internal structure of the pyramids reveals a continuous process of innovation and course correction. Within the Great Pyramid, for example, there are 3 known chambers: a subterranean chamber, the so-called Queen's Chamber, and the King's Chamber at the top. This suggests that the builders changed their minds, refining the design as they went. The complex system of relieving chambers built above the King's Chamber shows a sophisticated, experimental approach to managing the immense weight of the stone above. The pyramid wasn't just built to a static blueprint, it was an evolving project, with engineers solving unprecedented problems in real time, millions of tons of stone in the air. The media coverage of the Emu War was not entirely a joke. Some early reports were quite serious, framing it as a necessary measure to protect the nation's food supply and support struggling veterans. It was only after the first failed attempts that the tone shifted to one of mockery. This evolution in coverage shows how a narrative can change as events unfold. The story began as a patriotic endeavor and ended as a national punchline. This arc is what makes it so compelling. It's a story about good intentions, slowly curdling into a public farce, all under the watchful eye of the press. The fork's introduction created a new set of anxieties around dining. What if you used the wrong one? What if you held it incorrectly? This fork anxiety was a real social phenomenon. It's a testament to the power of etiquette to regulate social behavior. The fear of committing a faux pas, of revealing oneself as unsophisticated through a simple mistake with a utensil, was a powerful tool for maintaining social hierarchies. The fork became a small, silver-plated gatekeeper, and learning its secrets was a key to social acceptance in an increasingly complex modern world. Heidi Lamar was not the only Hollywood figure involved in the war effort's inventive side. The actor Douglas Fairbanks Jr. was a highly decorated naval officer who helped pioneer military deception techniques. The chef Julia Child worked for the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, helping to develop a shark repellent to protect underwater explosives. This hidden history of Hollywood's contribution to wartime innovation shows that Lamar, while exceptional, was part of a broader, often secret, mobilization of diverse talents. The fight against fascism required not just soldiers, but also actors, chefs, and composers, all using their unique skills in unexpected ways. The porter that flooded St. Giles was in the middle of fermenting. This means it was full of active yeast and carbon dioxide gas. The explosive rupture of the main vat was likely caused by a buildup of this gas pressure, combined with the structural failure of the iron hoop. The wave of beer itself would have been frothy and still actively fermenting, releasing its gas into the confined spaces of the cellars. This would have created an oxygen-poor environment, meaning some victims may have died not from drowning in liquid, but from asphyxiation in a cloud of carbon dioxide. This grim detail adds another layer of scientific horror to the already tragic event. The concept of a work strike existed even in ancient Egypt. One of the most famous documented labor disputes in history occurred at Deir el-Medina, the village of the tomb builders for the Valley of the Kings, around 1152 BC. The workers, complaining that their grain rations were late, laid down their tools and marched towards the temples, shouting, "We are hungry." It was, in essence, the first recorded sit-down strike. This shows that the pyramid builders and their descendants were not passive subjects. They had a clear sense of their rights, of the contract they had with the state, and they were not afraid to protest when that contract was broken. There's a persistent myth that emus can't walk backward, and this is why they are on the Australian coat of arms. This is not true. They can walk backward, though they rarely do. The symbolic meaning, however, has stuck. The Emu War adds a layer of irony to this symbolism. In their conflict with the army, the emus' primary tactic was to move forward but erratically, and to scatter. They didn't need to retreat in an orderly fashion. Their forward-moving nature was one of chaotic, unpredictable advance and dispersal, which proved to be a far more effective strategy than the military's organized, but ultimately futile, forward march. The fork's journey is also a story about the changing nature of food itself. In medieval times, much of the food was served in large chunks, requiring a knife for cutting and hands for eating. The rise of more complex cuisine in the Renaissance and Baroque periods, with sauces, stews, and more delicately prepared dishes, made the fork more useful. It's hard to eat a saucy dish with your fingers. The fork co-evolved with cuisine. As cooking became more refined, the tools for eating it had to become more refined as well, creating a feedback loop between the kitchen and the dining room. Finally, the sun begins its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The overseer calls an end to the day. The slow, exhausted procession begins, shuffling away from the growing shadow of the pyramid and back toward the village. Heidi Lamar's personal life was famously tumultuous. She was married and divorced 6 times. This series of relationships often overshadowed her career and her intellectual pursuits in the public eye. It fits into a tragic pattern where the romantic lives of brilliant women are often given more attention than their professional or intellectual achievements. Her 6 marriages became a staple of gossip columns, while her world-changing patent remained a secret for half a century. It's a stark reminder of the different standards by which men and women's lives are often judged and historicized. The location of the Mew Brewery on Tottenham Court Road is significant. Today, it's a major commercial street, but in the 19th century it was on the border between the wealthy districts of Bloomsbury and the impoverished slum of St. Giles. The brewery stood as a physical and economic bridge between these two worlds. It drew its wealth from the entire city, but posed its greatest physical risk to its poorest neighbors. The beer flood was a violent, physical manifestation of this proximity, a moment when the dangers of industry spilled out of the commercial world and literally drowned the domestic world next door. The pyramids are often seen as symbols of a tyrannical, slave-driving society, but the archaeological evidence points to a more nuanced picture. Building the pyramids required a huge, skilled, and motivated workforce. Motivating people through sheer terror is notoriously inefficient for complex, long-term projects. The system of rations, housing, medical care, and religious purpose was a far more effective way to organize society for such a monumental task. The pyramids are perhaps better understood not as monuments to tyranny, but as monuments to a society's incredible capacity for social organization and shared belief. The Emu War was not the only war Australia has declared on its animal population. The country has a long and troubled history of conflicts with introduced species, most notably the rabbit. The rabbit-proof fence, a massive barrier stretching over 1,000 miles across Western Australia, was another grand, ultimately futile, attempt to control an animal population. The Emu War is unique because it involved native animals and the formal deployment of the military, but it's part of a broader Australian story of grappling with a unique and often challenging environment, a story of fences, bounties, and, sometimes, soldiers. The fork is a strangely intimate object. Of all the utensils, it is the one that enters our mouths. This intimacy is part of what made it so controversial early on. To use a fork was to introduce a foreign, artificial object into a very personal space. The acceptance of the fork required a shift in our comfort level with this kind of prosthetic eating. We had to learn to trust this metal object, to make it an extension of our own hands. This process of familiarization is a small but profound chapter in the history of our relationship with technology. Heidi Lamar's scientific endeavors were, for her, a form of play. She approached inventing with a sense of fun and curiosity. It was a hobby, a passion project she pursued in her spare time. This is an important aspect of her story. It demystifies the process of invention. It doesn't always happen in a sterile laboratory with white coats and complex equations. Sometimes, it happens on a living room floor between a movie star and a composer, fueled by a shared sense of wonder and a desire to solve a puzzle. Her story celebrates the amateur spirit, the power of the passionate hobbyist to change the world. The aftermath of the beer flood saw a curious public response. On the one hand, there was sympathy for the victims. On the other, there was a great deal of humor. Jokes and cartoons about the beer barrel bursting circulated. This gallows humor was a common coping mechanism in an era when life was often precarious and disasters were frequent. It was a way of processing a horrific event, of rendering it less terrifying by finding a sliver of absurdity in it. The ability to make jokes about a river of beer, even a deadly one, was a way for Londoners to reclaim a sense of control in the face of a chaotic and unpredictable world. The Great Sphinx, which the pyramid builders would have seen every day, is as mysterious as the pyramids themselves. We don't know for sure who it represents, or exactly when it was carved. It seems to have been carved from a single outcrop of limestone, a natural feature of the plateau that was integrated into the sacred landscape. For the workers, it would have been a powerful and ancient guardian, a divine presence watching over their labor. Its enigmatic gaze would have been a constant feature of their world, a silent reminder of the deep, ancient magic that infused the very ground on which they worked. The cost of the Emu War, though small in military terms, was a subject of political debate. The 10,000 rounds of ammunition were not free. The cost of deploying the soldiers, their transport, and their supplies was questioned in Parliament at a time when the government was supposed to be practicing austerity. The opposition used the war as an example of government waste and incompetence. It was a perfect political storm, a failed operation that was not only embarrassing, but also a poor use of taxpayer money during the Great Depression. This financial angle was a key reason for the government's hasty retreat. The fork's design is heavily influenced by the food of the culture that uses it. The traditional Western fork, with its curved tines, is excellent for both spearing and scooping, reflecting a cuisine that includes everything from steaks to peas. In contrast, the chopsticks of East Asia are perfectly suited for picking up pieces of stir-fried food, vegetables, and rice. Neither is inherently better. They are just perfectly adapted to their culinary context. The form of our eating utensils is a direct reflection of the form of our food. You collect your pay, not in clinking coins, which don't really exist yet, but in rations of grain, oil, and cloth. It's a barter system, a tangible reward for a day of tangible, back-breaking labor that you can take home to your family. A significant figure in the rediscovery of Heidi Lamar's story was the inventor and writer, Robert A.H. Price. He wrote extensively about her patent in the 1990s, bringing it to the attention of the wider tech community. His work was instrumental in getting her the recognition she deserved from organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation. It's a reminder that history isn't just about what happened, it's about who tells the story. Without dedicated historians and enthusiasts digging into the archives, the contributions of people like Heidi Lamar might remain forgotten forever. One of the lasting consequences of the London beer flood was its impact on the insurance industry. The Act of God ruling created a precedent, but it also spurred insurers to be more specific in their policies. The disaster highlighted the need for businesses to have coverage for a wide range of potential accidents, even seemingly bizarre ones. In a way, the flood helped to professionalize the business of risk assessment. It was a very expensive and very tragic lesson in the importance of imagining the worst-case scenario, no matter how unlikely it might seem. The internal ramps theory is one of the leading explanations for how the pyramids were built. This idea suggests that instead of a long external ramp, the builders constructed a series of ramps inside the pyramid's outer casing, corkscrewing their way up as the structure grew. This would have been far more efficient, requiring less material and labor than a massive external ramp. Recent scans of the Great Pyramid have revealed tantalizing evidence of internal voids that might support this theory. It suggests a level of engineering ingenuity that is even more impressive than we previously imagined, a solution as elegant as it was hidden. The emus were not the only animals to cause trouble for the farmers. Flocks of galahs and cockatoos also feasted on the crops. Kangaroos were a constant nuisance. The focus on the emus was partly because of their size and the sheer scale of their flocks, but also because they were just so visible. A giant, flightless bird makes a much more dramatic target than a rabbit or a parrot. The Emu War was the most theatrical chapter in a much longer, quieter, and ongoing struggle between Australian agriculture and the continent's resilient native wildlife. The fork's story is a powerful lesson in how quickly social norms can change and then become entrenched. For centuries, using a fork was seen as bizarre and offensive. Then, in the space of a couple of generations, not using a fork became bizarre and offensive. We are often unaware of how arbitrary our own customs are, how the things we consider normal and natural are often just the accumulated habits of the recent past. The fork is a quiet reminder that the right way to do things is almost always a temporary consensus. Hedy Lamar's contribution to spread-spectrum technology was not just a lucky guess. It was based on a deep, intuitive understanding of signal and noise. She understood that to hide a signal, you had to make it look like random noise to anyone who didn't have the key. This is a foundational concept in modern cryptography. She wasn't just thinking about a mechanical solution. She was thinking about the very theory of information. This conceptual leap is what makes her contribution so profound and so enduring. She wasn't just building a better mousetrap. She was redefining the mousetrap. The Great Beer Flood left behind a legal ghost. The precedent set by the Act of God ruling was cited in later industrial accident cases in Britain. It became part of the legal framework that often shielded companies from the consequences of their operations. While the specific technology of wooden beer vats became obsolete, the legal principle they helped to establish had a much longer and more influential life, shaping the relationship between industry, the law, and the public for decades to come. The sound of the ancient Egyptian language is lost to us. We can read their hieroglyphs, but we don't know for sure how they were pronounced. When we imagine the overseers chanting to the work gangs, we can only guess at the cadence and melody. This lost soundscape is one of the great mysteries of ancient Egypt. The pyramids are a silent testament to a world of lost voices, the echoes of which we can only try to imagine. The rhythmic pulse of their language, the key to their work songs, is a secret the stones have kept. One of the most comical images from the Emu War is the description of the emus' evasive maneuvers. One soldier reportedly claimed that the birds would split into groups, with one group drawing the machine gun fire while the others circled around to attack from the flank. This is almost certainly an embellishment, a soldier's tall tale to explain away their failure. But it speaks to the sheer frustration of the soldiers. The birds' behavior was so chaotic and effective that it seemed like a deliberate, intelligent strategy. The soldiers were so thoroughly outclassed that they began to imagine their foe as a feathered Napoleon. The Fork's journey is a story of resistance to change. Every society has a deep-seated suspicion of new ways of doing things, especially when it comes to fundamental activities like eating. The fork was resisted because it was foreign, because it was seen as effeminate, and because it challenged a tradition that was thousands of years old. Its eventual triumph is a testament to the slow, relentless power of cultural change. But the long history of resistance is a reminder that innovation is never easy, and the path to acceptance is often long and winding. In the village, life continues. Children play, food is cooked, and stories are told. You might even have time to work on your own tomb, a smaller, more personal eternity project that the state allows and even supports. The irony of Hedy Lamarr's story is amplified by the nature of her on-screen persona. She often played the role of the femme fatale, a woman whose intelligence was a tool for manipulation and deceit. Her characters were often smarter than the men around them, but their intelligence was always in service of a romantic or criminal plot. In real life, she used her intelligence to try to save lives and contribute to a cause greater than herself. The public consumed the fiction of the manipulative genius, while the reality of the benevolent genius remained completely hidden. The Great Beer Flood is a story that almost feels like a dark fairy tale. It has all the elements: the giant's cauldron, the vat, the impoverished villagers living in its shadow, and the sudden, magical, but deadly flood. It's a story that taps into deep archetypes about industry, poverty, and the unpredictable nature of fate. Its enduring appeal lies in this mythic quality. It's a historical event that feels like it could have been dreamed up by the Brothers Grimm, a grim reminder of the strange and sometimes terrible poetry of real life. The pyramid builders had a sophisticated understanding of logistics. To construct the Great Pyramid, it's estimated that they had to quarry, transport, and place one massive stone block every 2 minutes 10 hours a day for 20 years. The sheer organizational challenge of this is mind-boggling. It required meticulous planning, a clear chain of command, and a system for managing resources on an unprecedented scale. The pyramids are not just architectural wonders, they are logistical masterpieces, a testament to the ancient Egyptians' genius for organization. The Emu War has become a powerful meme in the 21st century, particularly in online communities that enjoy military history and absurdist humor. The story is often used to create jokes about military incompetence or the surprising power of nature. This new life as a meme has introduced the story to a generation that might never have encountered it in a traditional history book. It's a fascinating example of how historical events are recycled and repurposed in the digital age, finding new audiences and new meanings long after they occurred. The fork is a tool of precision. It allows for a level of control and delicacy in eating that is difficult to achieve with hands or a spoon. This precision is reflected in the cuisine that developed alongside it. Think of French haute cuisine, with its elaborate presentations and carefully constructed bites. The fork is the perfect tool for dissecting and appreciating such a meal. It encourages a more analytical, less sensual approach to eating. It turns the diner from a simple consumer into a kind of gentle surgeon, carefully exploring the landscape of the plate. Hedy Lamarr's relationship with the press was a lifelong dance. In her youth, she needed the press to build her career, and she played the part of the glamorous star to perfection. In her later years, she retreated from the press, guarding her privacy fiercely. This withdrawal made her even more fascinating to the media, creating a mystique that they were desperate to penetrate. She understood the power of the media to both create and destroy, and she used both its presence and its absence to shape her own legend. The story of the London beer flood is a reminder of the fragility of urban life. We live in complex, man-made environments, surrounded by infrastructure that we take for granted. The flood was a moment when that infrastructure failed in a spectacular and deadly way. It's a story that resonates even today, in an age of power grid failures, bridge collapses, and other modern industrial accidents. It reminds us that our cities, for all their strength and complexity, are vulnerable, and that sometimes the systems we build to support us can fail with catastrophic consequences. The ancient Egyptians' concept of time was cyclical, not linear. They saw time as a repeating pattern of seasons, floods, and celestial movements. The pyramids were built to align with these eternal cycles. This worldview is very different from our modern, linear sense of time, with its focus on progress and moving forward. For the pyramid builders, the goal was not to create something new, but to maintain something ancient, the eternal, cosmic order of Ma'at. Their work was a constant act of renewal, not of innovation. The farmers' reaction to the failure of the Emu War was one of disappointment and grim resolve. They had hoped for a quick, decisive solution, and they didn't get one. But they were, by necessity, a resilient and practical group of people. When the army left, they simply went back to the old methods, shooting the birds themselves and building better fences. The bounty system was a welcome help, but ultimately they understood that the problem was theirs to manage. Their experience is a testament to the stoic, self-reliant spirit of the Australian bush. The fork's journey is a story about cleanliness and disgust. The increased use of the fork coincided with a growing sense of disgust about bodily functions and shared germs. What was once perfectly normal, eating with hands that had been licked clean, slowly became seen as repulsive. The fork was a tool that helped to manage this new, more sensitive emotional landscape. It kept the messiness of eating at a literal arm's length. The history of the fork is inseparable from the history of what we find disgusting. You are part of a complex, well-oiled machine. Not a machine of cogs and gears, but of human bone and muscle, all aligned by a singular, powerful belief in Ma'at, the cosmic order that you are helping to maintain with every stone you pull. The rediscovery of Hedy Lamarr's patent in the 1990s came at a perfect time. The internet was just beginning to enter the mainstream, and there was a growing interest in the hidden histories of technology. Her story, with its combination of glamour, genius, and injustice, was perfectly suited for the burgeoning digital age. It was a story that could be easily shared and celebrated online, turning her into a posthumous icon for a new generation. Her final fame was, fittingly, a product of the very communication revolution she had helped to unknowingly set in motion. The Great Beer Flood has a strange olfactory legacy. For years after the event, residents of the St. Giles area complained that their homes smelled of beer, especially on damp days. The porter had seeped into the very foundations of the buildings, a permanent, ghostly reminder of the disaster. This lingering scent is a powerful metaphor for the way trauma can haunt a place, a sensory ghost that refuses to be exorcised. The flood was gone, but its memory, carried on the air, remained. The pyramid texts inscribed on the walls of the inner chambers of later pyramids are the oldest known religious writings in the world. They are a collection of spells and incantations designed to help the deceased pharaoh navigate the afterlife and take his place among the gods. They are a kind of divine instruction manual, a cheat sheet for eternity. The builders who carved these intricate hieroglyphs were not just stonemasons. They were theologians inscribing the sacred software that would run on the pyramid's hardware. The Emu War is a story that has a moral, even if it's a silly one. It's a lesson in humility. The Australian Army, with all its training and technology, learned that some problems cannot be solved with brute force. They learned that nature is a complex and unpredictable system. And they learned that an emu is a much tougher and faster opponent than it looks. It's a story that gently mocks our human tendency to believe we can control everything, a comical reminder that sometimes the world has other plans. The modern place setting, with its array of different forks for different courses, a fish fork, a salad fork, a dinner fork, a dessert fork, is the logical endpoint of the fork's journey into specialization. It represents a high point of dining formality and complexity. This proliferation of forks can be seen as a kind of fork bureaucracy, a system of rules so complex that it requires special knowledge to navigate. It's a long way from the simple, scandalous golden fork of the Byzantine princess. Hedy Lamarr's story resonates so strongly because it is a story of potential, both realized and thwarted. She realized her potential as an actress and became a global icon. She realized her potential as an inventor and created a world-changing technology. But her potential to be recognized and rewarded for that invention during her lifetime was thwarted by the prejudices of her time. This mix of triumph and tragedy is what makes her story so compelling and so human. It's a story about the frustration of being brilliant in a world that only wants to see you as beautiful. The Great Beer Flood is a story about scale. In the pre-industrial world, a brewing accident might mean a spilled barrel and a sticky floor. In the industrial age, the sheer scale of production meant that a brewing accident could be a lethal, building-destroying flood. The disaster is a stark illustration of how industrialization magnified not just the output of production but also the consequences of its failure. The technology had grown so powerful that its failures were no longer minor mishaps, but full-blown catastrophes. The tools of the pyramid builders may have been simple, but their methods were not. They used sighting rods and plumb bobs to achieve almost perfect right angles and level surfaces. They may have used the reflection of stars and pools of water to achieve their precise astronomical alignments. They were masters of a kind of practical, observational science. They didn't have the abstract mathematics of the Greeks, but they had a deep, hands-on understanding of the physical world that allowed them to achieve results that still astound us today. The ultimate irony of the Emu War is that the bounty system, which was so much more effective than the military campaign, was eventually discontinued due to public protest. By the latter half of the 20th century, public attitudes towards native wildlife had shifted. The emu, once seen as a pest to be eradicated, was now viewed as a national treasure to be protected. The story of our relationship with the emu is a story of our own changing values, from a frontier mentality of conquest to a more modern conservationist ethic. The fork's journey is a story of globalization. It began in the Byzantine East, traveled to Italy, then France, then the rest of Europe and the Americas. In each new place, it was adapted and changed. Today, you can find a fork in almost any corner of the globe. It's a small, tangible piece of evidence of our interconnected world. Its story is a quiet, culinary history of how ideas, customs, and objects travel across borders, and slowly but surely reshape the world. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are helping people unwind. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you finally lie down to sleep, the aches in your body are a testament to your contribution. You are not just building a tomb, you are building a stairway to the heavens, ensuring the balance of the universe for one more day. The legacy of Hedy Lamarr is, in the end, a hopeful one. Yes, her story is one of frustration and injustice, but it is also one of ultimate vindication. The truth of her contribution eventually came out, and she is now celebrated for her brilliance. Her story has been reclaimed and retold, inspiring countless people. It's a powerful reminder that while the prejudices of an era can suppress the truth for a time, they cannot suppress it forever. History, eventually, has a way of finding its heroes. The London beer flood serves as a historical allegory. It's a story of an intoxicating substance, a source of pleasure and profit that literally bursts its container and brings ruin. It's not hard to see the parallels with other social problems, where a desire for profit or pleasure, when unchecked, can lead to devastating consequences. The story, in its strange, literal way, is a powerful metaphor for the need for regulation, responsibility, and a recognition of the potential dangers that lurk beneath the surface of our daily commerce. The relationship between the pyramid builders and their pharaoh was one of divine reciprocity. They labored for his eternity, and in return he, as a god, ensured the stability and prosperity of their world. It was a cosmic bargain. This belief system is what made the construction of the pyramids possible. It wasn't just a building project. It was the central economic and religious activity of the entire society, a project in which everyone, from the pharaoh to the farmer, had a crucial role to play. The Emu War is a classic David and Goliath story. If David were a flock of thousands of birds, and Goliath had a machine gun but couldn't aim, the story's appeal lies in this inversion of power. We expect the technologically superior force to win, and when it doesn't, it's both surprising and deeply satisfying. It's a story that celebrates the underdog and finds humor in the failure of the powerful. It's a reminder that strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes being fast, chaotic, and unpredictable is more effective than having all the firepower in the world. The fork story is a reminder that the objects we use every day have a history, and often a strange one. We are surrounded by things whose origins we never consider. The chair you're sitting in, the glass you drink from, the fork you eat with, all have a story to tell. They are silent artifacts of a long, slow process of invention, conflict, and change. To look at a fork and see not just a utensil, but a story of religion, class, and culture, is to see the world in a richer, more interesting way. Heidi Lamar's life was a testament to the fact that a person can contain multitudes. She was an actress and an inventor, a glamorous icon and a reclusive eccentric, a European immigrant and an American patriot. She refused to be defined by any single label. Her story challenges us to look beyond the simple categories we use to organize the world and to appreciate the complex, often contradictory, nature of a human life. She was not one thing. She was many things, and that is where her true genius lay. The story of the Great Beer Flood is, at its heart, a story about the invisible landscape of risk that surrounds us. The residents of St. Giles lived their lives unaware that a threat of biblical proportions was gathering in a giant wooden tank just a few hundred feet away. It's a sobering reminder that our safety often depends on systems and structures we cannot see. The flood was a moment when that invisible risk became terrifyingly visible, a sudden, violent eruption of an industrial danger into the fabric of everyday life. The pyramid builders were not just building tombs, they were building time machines. The pyramids were designed to last for eternity, to project the pharaoh's power and presence across all of time. And in a way, they succeeded. The pyramids have so far outlasted the civilization that built them that they seem to exist outside of normal human history. They are a message from a distant past, a tangible link to a world that is otherwise lost to us. The builders' ultimate achievement was not just conquering stone, but conquering time itself. The Emu War's legacy is a lesson in knowing your enemy. Major Meredith and his men went into the conflict assuming the emus would behave like a conventional foe, that they would be intimidated by firepower and could be defeated in a pitched battle. They completely misjudged their opponent's nature. This failure to understand the emus' instincts, speed, and resilience was the primary cause of their defeat. It's a lesson that applies far beyond the battlefield. To solve a problem, you must first understand it on its own terms, not on yours. The fork's universal adoption is a testament to its simple, elegant utility. It just works. While its journey was long and fraught with cultural conflict, its ultimate success was due to the fact that it is a genuinely useful tool. It solved a series of small but persistent problems at the dinner table. This practical usefulness is what allowed it to overcome centuries of prejudice. The story of the fork is a victory for good design, a reminder that in the long run, utility often triumphs over tradition. Now let's drift across time and space, leaving the sun-baked sands of Egypt for the wide, dusty plains of post-World War I Australia. Here, a conflict of a very different and, frankly, more ridiculous nature was about to unfold. It's 1932, and the nation is in the grip of the Great Depression. Many veterans of the Great War had been settled onto marginal farmland in Western Australia, encouraged to grow wheat, but their efforts were being thwarted not by drought or blight, but by an army of 20,000 emus. These giant, flightless birds, in their annual migration to the coast, had discovered that cultivated farmland was a far better buffet than the rugged interior. They descended upon the crops in vast, hungry flocks, trampling fences and devouring grain with an efficiency that would make a locust blush. The farmers, many of them hardened soldiers, took up their own arms against the feathered menace, but it was no use. They were simply outnumbered. The final years of Hedy Lamar's life were a mix of quiet solitude and unexpected connection. She rarely left her home in Florida, but she spent hours on the phone every day, talking to her children, friends, and a small circle of devoted fans. The telephone was her lifeline to the world, a technology that allowed her to be both present and remote. It's a fitting image for a woman who helped pioneer wireless communication. A life lived at a distance, connected by the invisible signals she had once dreamed of controlling. The Great Beer Flood is a story that has been largely forgotten by the general public, overshadowed by larger, more conventional disasters like the Great Fire of London. But its small, strange story is worth remembering. It offers a unique window into a specific moment in history, the gritty, dangerous, and often surreal world of industrial London. It's a reminder that history is not just made up of great wars and famous queens, but also of bizarre accidents, forgotten victims, and rivers of beer. The sheer audacity of the pyramids is something to behold. In the age of bronze tools and human muscle, the ancient Egyptians decided to build the largest, most perfect, and most enduring structures the world had ever seen. The level of ambition is staggering. It speaks to a culture with an immense confidence in its own power, its own beliefs, and its own ability to shape the physical world to match its spiritual vision. The pyramids are monuments to human ambition on a scale that has rarely been matched. The Emu War, in all its absurdity, is a profoundly human story. It's a story about trying to impose order on a chaotic world and failing. It's a story about good intentions leading to ridiculous outcomes. It's a story about the conflict between our ambitions and the stubborn reality of nature. And it's a story about the ability to look back at our failures and have a good laugh. It's a small, feathered footnote in history that reveals a great deal about our own species. The fork is a silent teacher of manners. From a young age, we are taught how to hold it, how to use it, how to place it on our plate when we are finished. These small lessons are our first introduction to the world of social etiquette. The fork is a tool that socializes us, that teaches us the unspoken rules of how to behave in the company of others. It is one of the first instruments we master in the long, complex performance of being a person in society. Heidi Lamar's story is a powerful argument for the importance of interdisciplinary thinking. Her breakthrough came from combining two seemingly unrelated fields, player pianos and military communications. This ability to see connections where others see only differences is a hallmark of creative genius. Her story encourages us to look for solutions in unexpected places, to break down the artificial walls between art and science, and to embrace the kind of playful, associative thinking that can lead to true innovation. The Great Beer Flood is a story that sticks with you because of its sheer improbability. If you were to write it as fiction, it would be dismissed as too absurd to be believable. But it really happened. Its reality is a powerful reminder that the past is a much stranger and more unpredictable place than we often imagine. It's a world where the mundane, brewing beer, can suddenly become monstrous, and the fabric of everyday life can be torn apart by the most unexpected of things. The pyramid builders left behind more than just stone. They left graffiti on the blocks, noting their work gang's name, like the Drunks of Menkaure or the Friends of Khufu. These small, human touches are incredibly poignant. They are a direct voice from the past, a reminder that these monuments were built by real people with a sense of humor, camaraderie, and pride in their work. They are a small crack in the monolithic facade of history, letting a little bit of humanity shine through. The Emu War serves as a humorous counterpoint to the usual narrative of human dominance over nature. We are accustomed to stories of taming wildernesses and conquering frontiers. The Emu War is a delightful inversion of that story. It's a case where the wilderness, in the form of a very large and very fast bird, simply refused to be tamed. It's a small, but satisfying, victory for the wild, a reminder that nature always gets a vote, and sometimes it votes no. The fork represents a triumph of a certain kind of logic. The hand is versatile but messy. The spoon is good for liquids, but not for solids. The knife can cut, but is awkward for carrying food. The fork solves a specific set of problems in a simple, effective way. It is a tool born of practical reason. Its long journey to acceptance was a battle between this cool, clean logic and the warm, messy logic of tradition. In the end, as is so often the case in the history of technology, the more logical solution won. Desperate and facing financial ruin, the farmers sent a deputation to the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pierce. Their request was unusual. They didn't ask for subsidies or new equipment. They asked for machine guns and the soldiers to operate them. Sir George, perhaps seeing a bit of good press in helping the beloved veterans and possibly swayed by the argument that the birds would make for good target practice, agreed. And so, in what must be one of the strangest deployments in military history, the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery was dispatched to the District of Campion. Their commanding officer was a Major G.P.W. Meredith. His arsenal consisted of 2 Lewis automatic machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. His enemy, a large flightless bird with a brain the size of a walnut. The stage was set for what the press would gleefully dub the Great Emu War. Hattie Lamar's story has a final, beautiful symmetry. Her greatest invention was about hiding signals, about creating a secret communication that could not be intercepted. Her own genius was, for most of her life, a kind of hidden signal, a secret identity that was not perceived by the wider world. The story of her life and the story of her invention mirror each other perfectly. Both were about secrets, and both were, eventually, brought into the light. The story of the Great Beer Flood is a story about the city itself. London in 1814 was a city of extreme contrasts, of immense wealth and desperate poverty, of technological marvels and appalling squalor. The flood was a moment when all these contrasts collided. It's a story that could only have happened in a place like that, at a time like that. It is a uniquely urban disaster, born from the very conditions of density, industry, and inequality that defined the 19th century metropolis. The legacy of the pyramid builders is a lesson in the power of a shared vision. It is difficult to imagine our modern, individualistic society mobilizing for a single project with such unity of purpose over so many generations. The pyramids challenge us to consider what we might be capable of if we could find a similar, unifying goal. They stand as a silent, stone rebuke to our own fragmented age, a testament to a time when a whole nation could look in one direction and build for eternity. The Emu War is, in the end, a story about perspective. From the farmer's perspective, it was a desperate struggle for survival. From the soldier's perspective, it was a frustrating and embarrassing professional failure. From the government's perspective, it was a political headache. And from the emu's perspective, it was just a Tuesday. The truth of the event lies somewhere in the intersection of all these viewpoints. It's a reminder that there is never just one story, but many, all happening at the same time. The fork is more than just a tool. It's a piece of our collective memory. It connects us to the Byzantine princess, the Italian courts, the skeptical Englishman, and the generations of people who argued about, adopted, and perfected this simple object. Every time we pick up a fork, we are holding a small piece of that history in our hands. We are participating in a ritual that is centuries old, a quiet link to the long, strange, and fascinating story of how we learn to eat. Heidi Lamar's story is ultimately a story of identity. Who gets to decide who we are? The studio that names us? The public that idolizes us? The government that dismisses us? Or do we get to define ourselves? Heidi Lamar's life was a long, quiet struggle for self-definition. She insisted, against all evidence to the contrary, that she was more than what the world saw. And in the end, history has proven her right. Her story is a victory for the stubborn, resilient, and brilliant power of the individual spirit. And so, as these stories fade and the quiet of the room settles around you, let the strange echoes of the past be a gentle guide into your dreams. Think of the patient strength of the pyramid builder, the chaotic victory of the emu, the unlikely genius of the movie star, and the surreal tragedy of the beer flood. Each is a thread in the immense, colorful, and deeply human story we all share. Let these tales be a soft, steadying weight, holding you gently as you drift into a deep and peaceful sleep. Good night. Narration LIPSA. Narration LIPSA. The first engagement took place on the 2nd of November 1932. Major Meredith and his men spotted a flock of about 50 emus. This, they thought, would be a simple matter. They were professionals with automatic weapons, facing off against birds. The soldiers carefully set up their ambush, hiding in the brush, waiting for the perfect moment. The emus, however, seemed to have an uncanny sixth sense. Just as the gunners were about to open fire, the birds, as if on some silent command, broke off into smaller groups and scattered in every direction. The subsequent machine gun fire was wildly inaccurate, a frantic spray of bullets into the vast Australian landscape. At the end of the day, Major Meredith reported a mere dozen or so birds killed. It was a deeply embarrassing start to the campaign. The emus, it seemed, were not going to be easy targets. The soldiers quickly learned that the emus possessed a kind of chaotic, unintentional tactical genius. They were fast, capable of sprinting up to 30 miles per hour, and their movements were completely erratic. Major Meredith himself noted with a grudging respect, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks." The emus seemed to be organized. Each small mob had a leader, a large black-plumed bird that would keep watch while the others ate. At the first sign of danger, this sentry would give a warning, and the entire flock would scatter, making effective use of the machine guns nearly impossible. The soldiers were being outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and thoroughly humiliated by their avian adversaries. The 10,000 rounds of ammunition were starting to look rather insufficient. The second major attempt at a decisive battle was even more of a fiasco. The military men tried a new tactic, mounting one of the Lewis guns onto a truck. The plan was to chase the emus down, firing from the moving vehicle. It was a disaster. The truck couldn't keep up with the birds over the rough terrain, and the ride was so bumpy that the gunner couldn't get a steady aim. At one point, in a scene that sounds like it was written for a silent comedy, an emu ran into the truck's path, got tangled in the steering gear, and caused the driver to swerve violently and crash through a farmer's fence. After firing nearly 1,000 rounds during this chaotic chase, the grand total of confirmed kills was possibly one emu. The press had a field day, with one newspaper joking that the birds were employing guerrilla tactics. After just 6 days, and the expenditure of 500 rounds of ammunition for a laughably small number of kills, Major Meredith and his men were recalled. The first campaign of the Great Emu War was over, and the emus had, by all accounts, won a decisive victory. The Minister of Defense faced ridicule in Parliament, with one politician asking if a medal would be struck for the men who fought in this war. Despite the public mockery of the farmers, pleas continued as the birds resumed their feasting unabated. A second military campaign was launched a few days later, this time with a slightly different approach. Major Meredith, a man who was probably very tired of birds at this point, was sent back out, but this time they focused on smaller, more successful ambushes rather than grand, sweeping engagements. The second attempt was marginally more successful. Over the next month, Major Meredith's unit managed to kill just under 1,000 emus, using up almost all of their remaining ammunition to do so. However, with an enemy force still estimated to be in the tens of thousands, it was a Pyrrhic victory at best. The military operation was simply not cost-effective. Ultimately, Major Meredith was withdrawn for good in December. The official military intervention was over. The emus had effectively seen off the Australian army. The government, realizing that machine guns were not the answer, turned to a more old-fashioned solution, a bounty system. This proved to be far more effective, with over 57,000 bounties being claimed in just 6 months. The Great Emu War stands as a bizarre and hilarious monument to human hubris and the surprising resilience of nature. From the battlefields of Australia, let's now travel to the dinner tables of history, to trace the journey of an object so common we barely think about it, yet so controversial it was once considered an instrument of the devil. I'm talking about the fork. For most of human history, eating was a hands-on affair. Fingers, spoons, and knives were the primary tools. The idea of using a special, pronged instrument to ferry food to your mouth was seen as strange, unnecessary, and even sinful. Early two-pronged forks did exist in ancient Greece and the Roman Empire, but they weren't for personal dining. They were large, robust implements used in kitchens and at tables for carving and serving large joints of meat, much like a modern carving fork. The notion of each individual having their own tiny fork was centuries away, an innovation that would have to travel a long and very winding road. The fork's journey into polite society begins, as so many sophisticated things do, in the opulent world of the Byzantine Empire. In the 11th century, a Byzantine princess named Theodora Anna Dukaina traveled to Venice to marry Domenico Selvo, the Doge of Venice. She brought with her a trousseau filled with the luxuries of Constantinople, including a case of small, two-pronged golden forks. At the wedding banquet, to the astonishment and horror of the Venetian court, she used this strange implement to eat her food. The local clergy were particularly scandalized. One influential cleric, Peter Damian, condemned her indulgence as a sinful vanity. He declared that God, in his wisdom, had provided humans with natural forks, their fingers, and to use an artificial substitute was an insult to the Creator. When the princess died of the plague a few years later, he declared it was divine punishment for her hubris and her wicked, pointy little utensil. The first thing you notice is the dark. Not a city dark, polluted with artificial light, but a deep, profound dark, punctuated only by the silver gleam of the moon on the nearby Nile. The air is cool, a temporary mercy before the sun arrives. Despite this inauspicious debut, the fork slowly began to catch on, but only among the very wealthy in Italy. It was seen as an affectation, a symbol of delicacy and status, particularly useful for eating sticky or syrupy fruits that would stain the fingers. For centuries, its use was confined almost exclusively to the Italian peninsula. When Catherine de' Medici moved to France in 1533 to marry the future King Henry II, she, like the Byzantine princess before her, brought her forks with her. She is often credited with introducing the fork to France, but its adoption there was glacial. For a long time, it was an object of mockery, associated with effeminate Italian manners. Frenchmen, and, most notably, the English, prided themselves on their robust, manly habit of eating with their hands and a knife. The fork was seen as fussy and unnecessary. Resistance to the fork was deeply ingrained in cultural identity. In the 17th century, an English traveler named Thomas Coriat was one of the first to adopt the Italian custom and use a fork back home. He was relentlessly mocked for his troubles, earning the nickname Furcifer, which meant fork-bearer, but was also a Latin pun on rascal or gallows bird. The clergy once again weighed in, arguing that it was an affront to Providence. The general sentiment was that it created an unnecessary distance between a person and their food, a sort of sterile barrier to the God-given pleasure of a meal. It would take a profound shift in social customs, a growing obsession with cleanliness, hygiene, and elaborate etiquette in the 18th and 19th centuries, for the fork to finally conquer the dinner table. It was the Industrial Revolution, with its mass production capabilities, that truly democratized the fork, making it an affordable and essential item for the burgeoning middle class. The design of the fork also evolved. The early two-pronged models were essentially sharp little spears, good for stabbing pieces of food but not much else. The development of the curved four-tined fork in Germany and France in the 18th century was the real game-changer. This new design was far more versatile. You could still spear food with it, but you could also use it like a spoon to scoop up peas or rice. This innovation, combined with the changing social mores, cemented the fork's place in the standard place setting. What was once a scandalous symbol of foreign decadence, an instrument of the devil, had become an indispensable tool of civilized dining, sitting quietly beside our plates, its long, controversial history completely forgotten. It's a quiet reminder that even the most mundane objects in our lives can have a surprisingly dramatic story. Now let us turn our attention from an object to a person, a woman whose story is a masterclass in hidden depths and profound irony. She was known to the world as a screen siren, celebrated by Hollywood as the most beautiful woman in the world. But behind the glamorous facade of the movie star was the mind of a brilliant, self-taught inventor, whose work would become a cornerstone of the digital age. This is the story of Heidi Lamar. Born Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler in Vienna, Austria in 1914, her life was remarkable from the start. As a young actress in Europe, she gained notoriety for her role in the controversial 1933 film Ecstasy. Fleeing an oppressive marriage and the looming threat of Nazism, she made her way to Hollywood, where she was renamed Hedy Lamarr and quickly molded into one of MGM's biggest stars. On screen, she was the exotic, mysterious beauty. Off-screen, however, her mind was constantly at work. Hedy Lamarr was not just a pretty face. She was a voracious learner with a keen, analytical mind. She had a passion for science and engineering, a side of her she largely kept hidden from the public and the studio heads who wanted to market her on her looks alone. In her trailer between takes, she wasn't running lines. She was tinkering, experimenting, and problem-solving. She came up with ideas for a traffic stoplight and a tablet that would dissolve in water to create a carbonated drink. But her most significant invention was born out of the urgency of World War II. Horrified by the reports of German U-boats sinking civilian ships, including one carrying children, she became determined to do something to help the Allied war effort. She knew that a major problem for the Allies was that radio-controlled torpedoes were easily jammed, their signals blocked by the enemy. Her inventive mind saw a potential solution in a rather unlikely place: a player piano. Lamar teamed up with an avant-garde composer and friend named George Antheil. Antheil was known for his wild, experimental compositions, including one piece that called for synchronizing 16-player pianos. Lamar realized that the mechanism a player piano uses to change notes, a perforated paper roll, could be adapted for a communication system. Her idea was to have both the transmitter on the ship and the receiver in the torpedo simultaneously jump between radio frequencies in a pre-arranged, synchronized pattern. This frequency hopping would make the guidance signal impossible for the enemy to track or jam. If the enemy tried to block one frequency, the signal would have already hopped to another. It was a brilliant, elegant solution to a critical military problem. Together, she and Antheil painstakingly worked out the details and, in 1942, were granted a patent for their secret communication system. Excited and proud, Hedy Lamarr offered her invention to the U.S. Navy. The response was not what she had hoped for. The Navy officials were dismissive. They looked at the patent, saw the name of a famous actress, and couldn't seem to take it seriously. They told her she would be better off using her celebrity status to sell war bonds. The technology, which was based on synchronizing player piano mechanisms, was also deemed too cumbersome to implement at the time. The patent was filed away and forgotten. Hedy, ever the patriot, did as they asked. She went on a massive USO tour and raised millions of dollars for the war effort, her groundbreaking invention collecting dust in a filing cabinet. The patent eventually expired, and she never made a single cent from her most brilliant idea. For decades, Lamar's contribution to science remained a secret, a footnote in a life defined by her Hollywood career. But history has a way of finding the truth. In the 1950s, long after the patent expired, engineers at Sylvania rediscovered the concept of frequency hopping. By the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, an updated version of Lamarr and Antheil's design was installed on U.S. Navy ships. But the true vindication came with the digital revolution. The principle of spread spectrum technology, which Lamarr had pioneered, turned out to be the fundamental building block for countless modern technologies. Every time you use Wi-Fi, connect a device via Bluetooth, or use a GPS to find your way, you are using a direct descendant of Hedy Lamarr's wartime invention. It wasn't until late in her life that her contribution was finally recognized, and she began to receive awards from the scientific community. Her story is a powerful testament to the hidden geniuses all around us, and a poignant reminder of how often we fail to see past the surface. For our final story tonight, let's travel back to 19th century London, to a tale that sounds like a bizarre fable but is tragically true. It's a story about industry, poverty, and a disaster of a most unusual kind. It involves no fire, no earthquake, no military conflict, but a literal flood of beer. This is the story of the London beer flood of 1814. Our scene is the parish of St. Giles, a densely populated and impoverished area of the city. It was a place of crowded tenements and overflowing slums, and in its heart stood the Mew and Company Brewery on Tottenham Court Road. This was a major industrial operation, home to some of the largest fermentation vats in all of England. One vat in particular was a true behemoth, standing 22 feet tall and holding the equivalent of over 500 barrels of porter, a dark, popular beer of the time. On the afternoon of October 17, 1814, a storehouse clerk named George Crick was doing his rounds. He noticed that one of the iron rings on the giant vat, a crucial piece of a low-tech but highly effective celestial surveillance system for a vat of this size, had slipped. This was not an uncommon occurrence, and repairs were scheduled. His boss told him not to worry, that no harm would come of it. This would prove to be one of history's more catastrophic understatements. About an hour later, the massive vat, containing over 135,000 imperial gallons of fermenting porter, ruptured with explosive force. The brewery wall collapsed, and the pressure wave set off a devastating chain reaction, smashing open several other large casks in the brewery. In an instant, a wave of dark, frothy beer, estimated to be 15 feet high, was unleashed upon the unsuspecting neighborhood of St. Giles. You are a stone hauler. Your day begins before the first prayers, awakened by the simple, communal stirring of your village. This isn't a collection of slave hovels. It's a planned town of skilled artisans and laborers, built by the pharaoh for this very purpose. The torrent of beer surged through the narrow streets and alleys with terrifying power. It wasn't a gentle spill, it was a destructive tsunami. It crashed into the flimsy tenement buildings, flooding cellars and first-floor rooms in moments. The disaster was particularly tragic for the residents of New Street, located directly behind the brewery. In one cellar, a group of people had gathered for a wake for a 2-year-old boy who had died the previous day. The beer wave slammed into the building, collapsing the walls and floor, and all the mourners, including the boy's mother, were either drowned or killed by the collapsing structure. In another building, a mother and her young daughter were swept away while having their tea. The scene was one of chaos, confusion, and dark, sticky destruction. In total, 8 people lost their lives in the London beer flood. The victims ranged in age from a 3-year-old girl to a 65-year-old woman. It's a common myth that people died from alcohol poisoning, rushing to drink the free-flowing beer from the streets. While some undoubtedly took advantage of the situation, the historical records are clear. The deaths were caused by drowning, blunt force trauma from the wave, or injuries from the collapsing buildings. The aftermath was grim. The air for blocks around was thick with the smell of beer and decay. Rescue efforts were mounted, and the survivors, many of whom had lost everything they owned, were left to pick through the wreckage of their homes, their meager possessions ruined and soaked in porter. In the wake of the tragedy, Mew & Company Brewery was taken to court. However, in a verdict that highlights the era's attitude towards industrial accidents, the entire event was ruled to be an act of God. No one at the brewery was held responsible. The company, far from being punished, actually petitioned Parliament for a refund on the excise tax they had already paid on the hundreds of thousands of gallons of beer that were now seeping into the London soil. Incredibly, they were granted the tax rebate, saving them from bankruptcy and allowing them to continue brewing. The disaster did, however, lead to a gradual change in the industry. The massive wooden fermentation vats were slowly phased out and replaced with more durable, lined concrete vats, ensuring that a tragedy of this specific, bizarre nature would never happen again. And so, our journey through the strange corridors of history comes to a close for tonight. We've walked with the builders of eternity in Egypt, stood against an avian army in Australia, traced the scandalous path of a fork to our tables, uncovered the secret genius of a movie star, and witnessed a flood of a most peculiar kind. Each story, a small thread in the vast, complex, and often deeply strange tapestry of our shared past. They remind us that behind the grand narratives of kings and empires, there are always these other stories, quieter, funnier, and sometimes just plain weirder. And it's in these stories that we can often find a more relatable, more human connection to the people who came before us. So as you let these tales settle, allow your mind to drift. Let the weight of the day recede, and welcome the quiet comfort of the night. Sleep well. The life of a pyramid builder was governed by the rhythms of the sun and the Nile. During the annual inundation, when the river flooded the fields and agricultural work was impossible, the labor force on the plateau would swell. Thousands of farmers would join the permanent crews of skilled masons, quarrymen, and artisans. This seasonal surge in manpower was a brilliant piece of civic planning, turning a period of forced idleness into the most productive time for the pharaoh's grandest projects. It meant the entire nation, in a way, had a hand in building these monuments. Your work gang might be composed of men from a dozen different villages, all brought together by the river's timeless cycle, their collective energy focused on a single, monumental goal that would outlast them all by millennia. It was a form of national service, a way of contributing to the cosmic order of the kingdom. Imagine the soundscape of the Giza Plateau, not the quiet reverence of a modern tourist site, but a constant, roaring symphony of labor. The sharp chink of copper chisels against limestone, the grating groan of massive stone blocks being dragged over wet sand, the rhythmic chanting of the work gangs, and the booming commands of the overseers echoing across the construction site. It was a place of immense, organized noise. This wasn't chaos, it was the sound of a civilization flexing its full industrial and organizational might. Every sound was part of a larger purpose, a percussive beat driving the slow, steady creation of a structure designed to touch the heavens. The air itself would have vibrated with the sheer energy of 10,000 men working in concert, a testament to what human beings can achieve when united by a powerful idea. Let's reconsider the Great Emu War from the perspective of the emus. For them, it wasn't a war, it was simply a change in catering services. For thousands of years, their migration patterns had followed the availability of native plants. Suddenly, these new bipedal creatures arrived and, with astonishing generosity, replaced the tough, sparse local flora with vast, irrigated fields of delicious, easily accessible wheat. From an emu's point of view, this was a spectacular stroke of luck. The arrival of men with loud, rattling sticks was certainly a nuisance, a rather aggressive form of pest control, but hardly a deterrent. The landscape was vast, and the birds were numerous and fast. The soldiers were a temporary noisy inconvenience in their newly discovered all-you-can-eat buffet. Their victory wasn't strategic. It was simply a matter of being better adapted to the environment than the military's tactics were. The legacy of the fork is tied deeply to the concept of civilization and contagion. Before the widespread adoption of the fork, communal dining often meant people dipping their hands into the same shared bowls and platters. The fork, along with the individual plate, helped create a personal dining space. This shift was accelerated by a growing, though not yet scientific, understanding of hygiene and the fear of disease. The fork was a tool of separation, a small metal barrier between you and the potential germs of your dining companions. It was part of a broader cultural movement towards bodily privacy and cleanliness that defined the so-called civilizing process. So while the clergy may have seen it as a barrier between man and God's bounty, society eventually came to see it as a welcome barrier between you and whatever your dinner guest might have been doing with their hands moments before. Hedy Lamar's frustration with her Hollywood career was palpable to those who knew her well. She famously said, "Any girl can be glamorous. All you have to do is stand still and look stupid." She felt trapped by her own beauty, a prisoner in the gilded cage of her public image. The studio system demanded she be a one-dimensional object of desire, and it had no interest in the brilliant, complex mind she possessed. Inventing was her escape, a way to exercise the part of her brain that Hollywood ignored. It was a private rebellion against the simplification of her identity. The irony that her greatest contribution to the world, a product of her formidable intellect, would go unrecognized for so long while her image was plastered everywhere, is the central tragedy and triumph of her story. She was a genius hiding in plain sight. The legal outcome of the London beer flood is a stark window into the 19th century mindset. The act of God ruling was a convenient way to absolve industry of responsibility, in an age where industrial accidents were common and often fatal. For the impoverished residents of St. Giles, there was no compensation, no official inquiry into potential negligence, and no safety net. Their lives and homes were simply collateral damage in the pursuit of commerce. The brewery's successful petition for a tax rebate on the lost beer adds a layer of bitter irony. The state effectively subsidized the company for the very disaster that had killed its citizens. It's a grim illustration of where the priorities of the establishment lay. Property and profit were protected, while the lives of the poor were tragically expendable. You chew on a piece of yesterday's bread, dense and hearty, and drink some water. The call to work isn't a whistle or a bell, but the slow, inevitable brightening of the eastern horizon. It's time to go. The tools of the pyramid builders were deceptively simple, yet incredibly effective. They used copper chisels and saws to cut the softer limestone, but for the hard granite used in the inner chambers, they needed something more. They would use dolerite, a type of hard, black, igneous rock, to pound the granite into shape. It was a process of relentless, patient abrasion. To move the massive blocks, they relied on wooden sledges, ropes made of papyrus reeds, and an army of men. Levers were used to painstakingly lift and position the stones. Their understanding of geometry and engineering was astonishing, all achieved without wheels for transport, without iron tools, and without a written system of advanced mathematics as we know it. It was a triumph of human ingenuity, patience, and sheer brute force, guided by an unwavering vision. The public and media reaction to the Great Emu War was a key factor in its swift conclusion. Newspapers across Australia and even internationally seized on the story, portraying it as a comical farce. Ornithologists and conservationists of the day also protested the campaign, arguing for the protection of the native emus. The image of the proud Australian military, fresh from the battlefields of World War I, being outwitted by a flock of birds, was too good a story to pass up. The government, and particularly the Minister of Defense, faced a wave of public mockery. This external pressure, combined with the operation's clear lack of success and high expenditure of ammunition, made it politically untenable to continue. In the end, the war was lost not just on the fields of Campion, but in the court of public opinion. The fork's journey was also a story of class. For centuries, it was an exclusively aristocratic item. To own a set of personal silver or gold forks was the ultimate status symbol, a way to distinguish oneself from the common rabble who ate with their hands. Etiquette manuals from the 17th and 18th centuries are filled with complex instructions on the proper handling of this novel utensil, turning its use into a performance of high-class refinement. When the burgeoning middle class began to adopt the fork in the 19th century, it was a form of social climbing, an imitation of the manners of their betters. The fork's democratization was part of a larger story of social mobility and the spread of aristocratic customs down the social ladder until what was once the exclusive habit of a princess became the daily practice of millions. It's worth pausing on the collaboration between Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil. It was a meeting of two wonderfully eccentric and brilliant minds. Antheil, the self-proclaimed bad boy of music, was a perfect creative partner for Lamarr. His work with player pianos gave him a deep, practical understanding of mechanical synchronization, which was the key to making Lamarr's concept work. They would spend hours on the floor of her living room, spreading out diagrams and working through the complex technical challenges. It was a partnership born of shared intellectual curiosity and a desire to contribute something meaningful beyond their artistic pursuits. The image of the glamorous movie star and the avant-garde composer inventing a foundational technology for Wi-Fi is one of history's most delightful and unexpected vignettes, a testament to the fact that innovation can come from the most unlikely of pairings. The beer from the London flood was porter, a dark, heavy beer that was the drink of choice for the city's working class. It was brewed with brown malt, giving it a rich, smoky flavor. The name porter itself is believed to have come from its popularity with the river and street porters of London. For many of the poor, beer was a dietary staple, safer to drink than the often contaminated water, and a crucial source of calories. The irony of the flood is that the very substance that sustained the community in small measures became the instrument of its destruction in a large one. The wave that swept through St. Giles was not just beer. It was a concentrated liquid manifestation of the industry that both employed and endangered the people living in its shadow. The social structure of the pyramid workers' village, known to archaeologists as Deir el-Medina for a later, similar settlement, was highly organized. There were distinct neighborhoods for different types of craftsmen. Scribes and overseers had larger homes, while the common laborers lived in smaller, standardized terraced houses. Yet it was a true community. They had their own law court, their own chapels, and a vibrant social life. Workers were organized into two gangs or sides, the left and right, who would often compete with each other. This fostered a sense of team spirit and camaraderie that was essential for the difficult work. It was a far cry from the brutal, anonymous slavery depicted in fiction. These were people with names, families, and a place in a complex, functioning society built entirely around the great work. Let's spare a thought for Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery. He was a career soldier, a veteran of the Great War tasked with a serious job. And then he was ordered to make war on birds. His official reports from the campaign are a fascinating read, a mix of military formality and barely concealed frustration. He writes about the emu's remarkable ability to carry wounds and their cunning tactics. You can almost feel his professional dignity eroding with each failed engagement. He was a man trained to fight organized armies, to use logistics and strategy, but none of that applied to an enemy that simply ran away in 1,000 different directions at once. His ultimate withdrawal must have been a moment of profound relief, finally free from his maddening, feathered, and ultimately victorious foe. The knife has a much different history than the fork. The personal knife is one of the oldest human tools, always present at the table. For centuries, a man would carry his own knife, using it for everything from cutting his food to defending himself. The fork's introduction actually changed the knife. Before the fork, knives often had sharp, pointed tips, useful for spearing food and carrying it to the mouth. As the fork took over the job of spearing, the table knife began to evolve into the duller, rounded-tip implement we know today. Its primary job became cutting and pushing food onto the fork. The rise of one utensil directly led to the specialization of another, a small, quiet evolution in the ecosystem of the dinner plate. The denial of Hedy Lamarr's patent by the Navy had long-lasting consequences, not just for her, but for the war effort. While the player piano mechanism was deemed too clunky, the core concept of frequency hopping was sound and could have been developed with other technologies. Had the Navy taken her idea seriously and invested in its development, a secure guidance system for torpedoes could have been deployed much earlier, potentially saving countless lives and ships. It's a sobering what-if of history. The dismissal was not just an insult to a brilliant woman, it was a strategic blunder, a failure of imagination born from prejudice. It demonstrates how societal biases can have very real, very tangible costs, even in the life and death calculations of a world war. The geography of St. Giles was a key factor in the London beer flood's lethality. The area was a natural basin, a low-lying part of the city. When the vats at the Mew Brewery ruptured, the beer had nowhere to go but down, flowing into the streets and cellars of the surrounding slum. The neighborhood, known as the Rookery, was a maze of narrow, poorly constructed buildings which acted like channels, funneling the wave and increasing its destructive power. It was a classic case of the dangers of placing heavy industry cheek by jowl with impoverished, high-density housing. The disaster wasn't just an act of God. It was a tragedy waiting to happen, a fatal intersection of industrial scale, urban poverty, and simple gravity. The walk to the Giza Plateau is your morning commute. You join a river of thousands of other men, a low murmur of conversation filling the air. Ahead, the silhouette of the Great Pyramid looms, a man-made mountain scratching at the stars. The concept of Ma'at was the central, guiding principle of ancient Egyptian life, and it's key to understanding the motivation of the pyramid builders. Ma'at was the divine order, the cosmic balance of truth, harmony, and justice. The pharaoh was the earthly guarantor of Ma'at. His successful journey to the afterlife and transformation into a god was essential for maintaining this balance for the entire kingdom. Therefore, building his pyramid was not just a construction project, it was a crucial religious act. Every worker, from the highest architect to the lowliest water carrier, was participating in a sacred duty to uphold the very order of the universe. This shared belief system was a more powerful motivator than any whip could ever be, turning a lifetime of hard labor into a meaningful, spiritual endeavor. The emu's unique physiology made it a surprisingly tough adversary. Its loose, shaggy feathers acted like a kind of natural, albeit ineffective, armor, often causing bullets to deflect without hitting a vital organ. An emu could be shot multiple times and continue to run at full speed, seemingly unfazed. This resilience shocked the soldiers, who were accustomed to their targets falling after a well-aimed shot. Major Meredith's comparison of them to tanks, while exaggerated for effect, captured this frustrating invulnerability. The birds were simply built for survival in a harsh environment, and that toughness translated unexpectedly well to the battlefield. They were, in essence, biologically programmed to be difficult to kill, a feature that the Royal Australian Artillery discovered to their immense chagrin. The spread of the fork throughout Europe can be mapped like a slow-moving cultural wave. From its 11th century arrival in Venice, it took nearly 500 years to gain a foothold in France. From France, it slowly trickled into the courts of Germany and Spain. England was one of the last major holdouts, viewing the fork as a sign of Italian and French foppishness well into the 17th century. America, in turn, inherited its dining customs from England, so the fork was a late arrival there as well. Even then, early American etiquette dictated a strange zigzag method, where food was cut with the knife in the right hand, then the knife was put down, and the fork was switched to the right hand to eat. The history of the fork is a history of cultural transmission, resistance, and eventual, universal adoption. The rediscovery of Hedy Lamarr's work is a story in itself. It wasn't until the 1990s that her role became widely known, thanks in large part to the efforts of a few dedicated fans and historians who stumbled upon her expired patent. When the Electronic Frontier Foundation gave her an award in 1997, the elderly Lamar's reported response over the phone was, "Well, it's about time." There's a bittersweet quality to her late-life recognition. While she finally received the credit she deserved, it came long after it could have changed her career or her life's trajectory. Her story serves as a powerful cautionary tale about the geniuses we overlook and the importance of looking beyond the roles society assigns to people, whether on a movie screen or in real life. In the immediate aftermath of the London beer flood, a strange sort of macabre tourism took place. People from all over London flocked to St. Giles to see the devastation for themselves. Some even paid the families of the victims to see the bodies laid out in their homes before the funerals. This morbid curiosity was a common feature of the era, a time before mass media, when disasters were a form of public spectacle. For the residents of the Rookery, it was another layer of indignity on top of their loss. Their private grief became a public exhibition, their tragedy a temporary diversion for the more fortunate citizens of the city. It highlights the stark class divides of the time and the different ways in which human suffering could be processed and even consumed as a form of entertainment. Let's consider the diet of a pyramid builder. It was surprisingly wholesome and calorie-dense, designed to fuel immense physical exertion. The core of the diet was bread and beer, both made from emmer wheat and barley. This was supplemented with an abundance of vegetables, particularly onions, garlic, and radishes, which were believed to have medicinal properties. Fish from the Nile provided protein, and on special occasions or for higher-ranking workers, there would be beef. Archaeologists excavating the workers' village have found vast quantities of cattle bones, far more than would be expected for a slave population. These men were well fed. They were the state's most valuable asset, the engine of its monumental ambitions, and the government knew that a well-fed engine runs best. The legacy of the Great Emu War in Australia is a curious one. It has become a beloved piece of national folklore, a story told with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. It embodies a certain Aussie spirit of battlers taking on a ridiculous challenge and having a laugh about it afterwards. The story has been the subject of documentaries, podcasts, and is even slated for a film adaptation. The emu itself has, in a way, become a national symbol of resilience and defiance. It's a story that reminds people that sometimes the most well-laid plans of military strategists can be undone by the simple, chaotic forces of nature, and that sometimes the best course of action is to admit defeat and just call for a bounty hunter. The fork's battle for acceptance was not just against tradition, but against the other utensils. For a time, it competed with the suck-it fork, a strange hybrid utensil with a two-pronged fork at one end and a small spoon at the other. It was designed for eating suckets, which were fruits preserved in syrup. You'd spear the fruit with the fork and then sip the syrup with the spoon. This all-in-one gadget eventually fell out of favor as place settings became more elaborate, with specialized utensils for every course. The suck-it fork is now a museum curiosity, a fossil from an earlier stage of utensil evolution, a reminder of a time when the dinner table was a place of wild experimentation. Hedy Lamar's intellectual life extended beyond inventing. She was an avid reader and had a deep interest in many subjects. She was also a shrewd businesswoman in her own right. After her contract with MGM ended, she became one of the first actors to co-produce her own films, seeking more control over her career. This desire for agency and intellectual engagement was a constant theme in her life. She was always pushing against the boundaries that had been set for her. The invention was the most dramatic example, but her entire life can be seen as a quiet, determined effort to be recognized as more than just a beautiful face, to be the author of her own story, not just a character in someone else's. The Mew and Company Brewery actually survived the 1814 flood and continued to operate for over a century. The disaster, while tragic, did little to harm its business in the long run, thanks to the tax rebate. The site of the brewery is now occupied by the Dominion Theatre, a major West End landmark. There is no plaque, no memorial to the 8 people who lost their lives there. It's a place where thousands of people now go for entertainment, completely unaware that they are standing on the site of one of London's strangest and most tragic industrial disasters. The memory of the flood, much like the beer itself, has seeped away, leaving behind only the faintest historical trace. You don't punch a time clock. Instead, you check in with a scribe, who sits cross-legged with his palette and papyrus, making a meticulous note of your name and your work gang. This is less about docking your pay and more about cosmic accounting. The sheer scale of the Giza pyramid complex is hard to comprehend, even when you're standing right there. It wasn't just the one great pyramid. It was three main pyramids: the Great Sphinx, numerous smaller queens, pyramids, causeways, temples, and a vast necropolis of tombs for the nobility. For the workers, this meant the project was continuous, spanning multiple generations. A man might start his career working on his pharaoh's father's pyramid, spend the bulk of his life on his own pharaohs, and in his old age begin work on the Tomb of the Heir. It was a lifetime's work, a continuous, evolving project. This generational continuity provided stability and a deep, ingrained sense of purpose, passed down from father to son. The choice of Lewis guns for the Emu War was significant. The Lewis gun was a light machine gun, famous for its use in World War I, particularly in aircraft and by infantry in the trenches. The soldiers deployed were veterans familiar with this weapon. There's a deep irony in this. These men had used these guns against human soldiers in the horrific battles of the Western Front. Now they were being asked to turn that same firepower, designed for industrial-scale warfare, against a flock of birds in their own country. The psychological disconnect must have been immense. The campaign's failure was not just a tactical one. It was a failure of context, a demonstration that the tools of total war are surprisingly useless against an enemy that refuses to play by the rules of engagement. The social ritual of the dinner party was profoundly shaped by the fork. Before its common use, elaborate hand-washing ceremonies were a crucial part of any formal meal, both before and during the feast. Servants would circulate with basins of scented water and towels. The fork, by reducing the need to touch food directly, made these rituals less necessary. It helped shift the focus of etiquette from managing a necessary messiness to the more subtle art of manipulating a set of specialized tools. The rules of which fork to use for which course became a new kind of social test, a way to signal one's breeding and sophistication. The fork didn't just change how we ate, it changed how we performed the act of eating. Hedy Lamarr's relationship with her own beauty was complex and often tinged with sorrow. While it opened the doors to fame and fortune, she felt it was a mask that prevented people from seeing her true self. In her later years, she became a recluse, communicating with the world mostly by telephone. She had a series of unsuccessful plastic surgeries, perhaps in an attempt to hold on to the very thing she felt had defined and limited her. It's a poignant paradox. The woman whose image was synonymous with glamour spent her final decades avoiding being seen, her inventive mind still sharp, but her famous face a source of private torment. Her story is a cautionary tale about the burdens of being an icon. The St. Giles Rookery, where the beer flood occurred, was infamous long before 1814. It was one of London's most notorious slums, a place associated with crime, poverty, and disease. The artist William Hogarth depicted its squalor in his famous 1751 print, Gin Lane, which was set in the very same neighborhood. The beer flood can be seen as a darkly ironic sequel. Where Hogarth had warned of the societal ills of gin, fate delivered a deluge of beer. The disaster brought a brief, shocked attention to the appalling living conditions in the rookery, but lasting reform was slow to come. For the most part, once the beer was cleaned up, polite society was content to once again forget about the people living in the shadow of the brewery. The end of a pyramid builder's life was, in many ways, as provided for as his working life. If a worker died on the job, he was given a proper burial in the workers' cemetery near the pyramid. These tombs were not grand, but they were furnished with pottery, food offerings, and other goods for the afterlife. This was a significant honor. To be buried in the shadow of the pharaoh's own eternal home was to be linked to his divine journey. It was the ultimate reward for a life of service. It ensured that even the common laborer had a chance at immortality, his own small part in the grand cosmic scheme that he had helped to build with his own two hands. Following the military's withdrawal, the emu problem didn't magically disappear. The bounty system, while more effective, created its own set of problems and a new kind of profession: the emu hunter. For years, these hunters culled the emu population. However, the story has a more modern, conservationist epilogue. Today, emus are a protected native species in Australia. While farmers still face challenges, they now use more sophisticated methods like specially designed emu-proof fences. The war is long over, and a kind of truce has been settled. The emus, having faced down machine guns and won, have earned a grudging respect and a permanent, if sometimes troublesome, place in the Australian landscape. There's a fascinating detail in the history of the fork concerning pasta. In Naples, the traditional way to eat spaghetti was to lift it with your hands and lower it into your mouth. It was a messy public affair. The development of a fork with more than 2 tines was driven, in part, by the Neapolitan court's desire to eat their favorite dish with more decorum. A multi-tined fork allowed one to twirl the long strands of pasta, a far more elegant solution. So in a very real sense, the modern fork was perfected as a direct response to the challenge of eating spaghetti politely. It's a perfect example of how a specific culinary need can drive technological and social innovation. Even at the dinner table, the name of Hattie Lamar and George Antheil's patent, secret communication system, is itself quite revealing. It wasn't just about torpedoes. They understood the broader implications of their invention. In the patent, they mention its potential for secure voice and data transmission. They were envisioning a world of secure wireless communication long before such a thing was a reality. They were not just solving a single military problem, they were laying the conceptual groundwork for the encrypted, data-driven world we now inhabit. The tragedy is that they were so far ahead of their time that the very people they were trying to help couldn't grasp the full scope of their vision. They weren't just inventors, they were prophets of the digital age. The smell of the great beer flood must have been overwhelming. First, the sweet, malty, yeasty aroma of the fresh porter would have filled the air, but as the hours and days passed, that would have given way to a much less pleasant stench. The beer, mixed with the mud and filth of the London streets, would have begun to sour and stagnate. The cellars of homes would have become fetid ponds. For weeks, the neighborhood of St. Giles would have been enveloped in a powerful, inescapable miasma of stale beer and decay. It was a sensory assault, a constant, grim reminder of the disaster that had torn through the community, a smell that would have lingered long after the liquid itself had been cleared away. Your gang is assigned to the causeway today. The task is simple in concept, monumental in practice, moving a 2.5-ton block of limestone from the quarry docks to its place on the ramp. Your tools are a wooden sledge, ropes, and raw manpower. The quarrying process for the pyramids was a monumental task in itself. Workers would find cracks in the limestone or granite bedrock. They would then hammer in wooden wedges. After the wedges were securely in place, they would pour water over them. The wood would absorb the water and expand, and the immense, slow pressure of the swelling wood would be enough to split the massive block of stone from the rock face. It was a slow, patient process, using the simple laws of physics to achieve incredible results. The quarried blocks were then moved to the river, loaded onto barges, and floated to the construction site during the annual flood. The entire operation was a masterpiece of logistics, a perfectly choreographed dance between human labor and the natural world. An interesting footnote to the Emu War is that it wasn't a uniquely Australian folly. In 1932, the same year as the Emu conflict, the United States government was dealing with its own problem of veterans and economic hardship, which culminated in the Bonus Army protest in Washington, D.C. There, the U.S. Army, under Douglas MacArthur, used tanks and tear gas to disperse the unarmed veterans. The contrast is stark and telling. While the Australian military was engaged in a comical, largely harmless battle against birds, the U.S. military was engaged in a grim, violent confrontation with its own citizens. In a strange way, the absurdity of the Great Emu War makes it seem almost humane by comparison. The fork's journey to acceptance in America had its own unique twist. For a long time, the dominant custom was to use the fork only in the left hand, to hold food steady while it was cut with the knife in the right hand. To actually eat, you would put the knife down and switch the fork to your right hand, with the tines pointing up. This fork switching became a hallmark of American etiquette, seen as clumsy and inefficient by Europeans who had adopted the more streamlined method of simply eating with the fork in the left hand. This small, seemingly trivial difference in table manners became a subtle cultural marker, a tiny declaration of independence from old-world customs, played out at every meal. The financial side of Heidi Lamar's life was as turbulent as her career. Despite earning millions as a movie star, a series of bad investments and lavish spending left her with very little in her later years. She was even arrested for shoplifting in the 1960s, a sad and public moment of decline. The fact that she was sitting on a patent that would eventually be worth billions is the ultimate irony. Had she been able to capitalize on her invention, her life story might have had a very different third act. Instead of a reclusive existence marred by financial worry, she could have been a celebrated tech mogul. It's a powerful story about the difference between having a brilliant idea and having the power and position to profit from it. The response of the St. Giles community to the beer flood was one of remarkable resilience. Neighbors helped neighbors, pulling survivors from the wreckage and offering shelter to those who had lost their homes. The local church became a makeshift morgue and relief center. In the face of official indifference and a bizarre disaster, the community turned inward, relying on its own social bonds to survive. These acts of mutual aid and support are often left out of the official histories, which focus on the spectacle and the legal proceedings, but they are a crucial part of the story, a testament to the strength and solidarity of ordinary people in the face of extraordinary circumstances. The role of the scribe in the pyramid building process was absolutely critical. They were the project managers, the accountants, and the record keepers of the entire operation. Using papyrus scrolls and a palette of red and black ink, they meticulously tracked the workforce, inventoried tools, recorded the movement of stone blocks, and managed the distribution of rations. Their detailed records, some of which have survived, like the Journal of Merer, give us an unprecedented day-by-day look into the logistics of the construction. Without these highly educated administrators keeping the whole vast enterprise organized, the project would have collapsed into chaos. The pyramids are as much a monument to bureaucracy and project management as they are to architecture and manual labor. The Great Emu War has often been misinterpreted as a simple case of man versus nature, but it's more complex than that. It was a conflict born directly from ecological change wrought by humans. The new wheat farms created an artificial paradise for the emus, causing their population to explode and their migration patterns to shift. The war was an attempt to solve a problem that humans had, in fact, created. It's a classic example of an ecological boomerang effect. The farmers weren't fighting nature in its pure state. They were fighting the unintended consequences of their own efforts to tame it. The emus were just following the food, and the soldiers were just trying to clean up the mess. Let's consider the spork, the modern, often mocked day from a symbol of high-class, specialized luxury to a disposable piece of plastic, designed for maximum efficiency in fast food restaurants and school cafeterias. While a fork was once an indicator of civilization and refinement, the spork is often seen as its opposite. Its existence, however, speaks to the same core drivers that shaped the fork: a desire for convenience and a tool that is perfectly suited to the specific needs of the meal, even if that meal is a cup of chili from a drive-thru. One of the most remarkable things about Heidi Lamar is that she had no formal training in engineering or science. She was entirely self-taught, driven by an insatiable curiosity and a natural aptitude for problem-solving. Her mind was her laboratory. This makes her achievement even more astounding. She wasn't working with a team of engineers in a well-funded lab. She was working from first principles, observation, and creative intuition. Her story is a powerful argument against the idea that innovation is the exclusive domain of credentialed experts. Sometimes, a revolutionary idea comes from an outsider, someone with a fresh perspective who isn't constrained by conventional thinking. Someone like a Hollywood movie star with a passion for player pianos. Water is poured on the sand in front of the sledge's runners to reduce friction. An overseer, a man chosen for his booming voice and organizational skills, begins a chant. It's a rhythmic song of work, keeping all of you pulling in perfect, muscle-straining unison. The financial loss to the Mew Brewery from the flood was substantial, even with the tax rebate. They lost an estimated 323,000 imperial gallons of beer in total. In today's terms, that would be millions of dollars worth of product, instantly gone. The brewery's ability to absorb such a loss and continue operating is a testament to the immense profitability of the London beer trade in the 19th century. Beer was the fuel of the industrial city, and the major breweries were industrial powerhouses, their wealth and influence often rivaling that of other major industries. The flood, while a disaster, was ultimately just a very, very big write-off in a much larger story of commercial success. The precision of the pyramid builders is, perhaps, the most baffling aspect of their work. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with a degree of accuracy that modern engineers would find difficult to replicate. The massive casing stones, long since stripped away, were cut and polished so finely that the gaps between them were less than a 50th of an inch. How they achieved this level of precision on such a colossal scale with relatively simple tools remains a subject of intense debate. It suggests a deep, masterful understanding of observation, surveying, and practical geometry that was passed down through generations of master builders. It was a level of craftsmanship that seems almost superhuman. The term Emu War itself was a creation of the press. It was a catchy, slightly mocking headline that captured the public imagination. For the soldiers and farmers involved, it was a serious, if frustrating, pest control operation. But the label transformed it into something more. It framed the conflict in epic, albeit ridiculous, terms. This act of naming was powerful. It cemented the event in public memory as a, quote, war, ensuring its legacy as a piece of folklore rather than a forgotten agricultural dispute. It's a small example of how the media can shape our understanding of history, turning a strange footnote into a legendary national story through the simple power of a good headline. The fork's triumph was not complete until it had conquered the final frontier, the home. For a long time, even after it was accepted in public dining, many people continued to eat with their hands or just a knife and spoon in the privacy of their own houses. The widespread adoption of the fork as an everyday household item is a relatively recent phenomenon, tied to the rise of the middle class in the 19th and 20th centuries and the mass production of affordable cutlery. The moment when a family of modest means could have a full set of forks in their kitchen drawer was the moment the fork's long journey from scandalous luxury to mundane necessity was finally complete. Hedy Lamarr's legacy is a dual one. In the popular imagination, she remains the glamorous star of Hollywood's golden age, her face a symbol of classic cinematic beauty. But in the world of technology and science, she is remembered as the mother of Wi-Fi, a brilliant innovator whose contribution was overlooked for far too long. These two legacies exist in a kind of tension, and it is in that tension that the real Hedy Lamarr can be found. She was both, and the failure of her contemporaries to see that is a reflection on them, not her. Her story forces us to reconcile the artist with the scientist, the icon with the inventor, and to acknowledge the complex, multifaceted nature of a truly remarkable individual. The porter that flooded St. Giles was a strong beer with a higher alcohol content than many modern beers. However, the idea that the flood created a scene of mass public intoxication is largely a myth that developed later. The contemporary accounts focus on the destruction and drowning, not on revelry. The sheer force and speed of the wave would have made collecting and drinking the beer a difficult and dangerous proposition. And for the residents whose homes were destroyed, celebrating with free beer was likely the last thing on their minds. The story of the drunken flood is more of a colorful embellishment than a historical fact, a way of adding a touch of comic absurdity to a genuinely tragic event. Let us imagine the final moment of the pyramid's construction. The placement of the pyramidion. This was the capstone, often made of a finer stone like granite and sometimes plated with electrum, a mixture of gold and silver. This final stone, placed at the very apex of the pyramid, would have been a moment of immense ceremony and celebration. After decades of labor, the structure was finally complete. As the pyramidion was hoisted into place, it would have caught the first and last rays of the sun each day, a shining beacon visible for miles around. For the workers watching from below, it would have been a moment of profound accomplishment, the culmination of a lifetime's work, the final punctuation mark on their monumental sentence written in stone. The Great Emu War serves as a perfect illustration of asymmetric warfare, albeit in a non-human context. A large conventional force, the army, was defeated by a smaller, more mobile, and unconventional opponent, the emus. The emus had no central command, no supply lines to disrupt, and no desire to engage in a pitched battle. They used their superior knowledge of the terrain and their natural speed to their advantage, dispersing when confronted and regrouping later. They frustrated the army's ability to bring its superior firepower to bear effectively. It's the same principle that has allowed guerrilla forces to stymie powerful armies throughout human history. The emus, in their own chaotic way, were natural-born guerrilla fighters. The evolution of table manners is a fascinatingly slow process. For instance, the very idea of a place setting with a specific spot for each utensil is a product of the 19th century French and British bourgeoisie. Before that, dining was often more chaotic, with utensils placed in the center of the table for common use. The fork's acceptance was part of this larger trend towards order, individualism, and unspoken rules at the dinner table. These rules, which we now take for granted, were once a complex new language that had to be learned, a social code that separated the refined from the coarse. Every time you instinctively place your fork on the left, you are participating in a ritual with a long and surprisingly contentious history. There's a poignant detail about Heidi Lamar's patent. She put the name of her patent attorney on it as a co-inventor, but George Anthiel's name was listed first. Some speculate this was a deliberate choice, believing a man's name at the top would give the invention a better chance of being taken seriously. It's a small but telling detail that speaks to the world she was operating in. She was brilliant enough to conceive of the technology, but also savvy enough to understand the social prejudices that might stand in its way. She was playing a complex game, trying to navigate a system that was not designed to recognize or reward a woman like her.